Log on, tune in, find out. Another good idea from Cambridge.
Well, it's a great pleasure and privilege to have a chance to talk to James Scott. James, I always ask can I call you James? I hope I may.
Or Jim.
Or Jim. What do you people call you? Jim? Jim. Okay. Jim, I usually start by asking you when and where you were born.
Well, I was born in a small town in New Jersey, between Camden and Trenton along the Delaware River, where my father was a doctor.
When was this?
In 1936,
Yeah.
December 2nd.
Yeah.
And I know that in talking about one's biography, there's this effort to create a kind of false coherence to
Yes.
the story. And the reason why it's a little difficult is because I don't believe such a coherence actually exists except ex post facto.
Yeah.
So you can't believe a word I say, at least in terms of the sequence that I've put together. I grew up. My father, as I said, was a physician, and he settled in a small town, which was an industrial town. And he died when I was 9 years old. I think this is during the second. He died in 1946, and there were, I think, 3 doctors in the town. The other 2 were drafted into the armed services, and he was declared unfit because he had high blood pressure. And the net result was, of course, he was the only doctor, probably a lot busier than he would have been if he'd been in the armed services. And he had a stroke in 1946. And its effect on me, I think, was that we went from being relatively well-to-do. In those days, doctors weren't paid enormous salaries compared to the general civilian population, but my father was relatively well-to-do in this small town. My mother had no particular skills, had been raised in a rather privileged background, but with not a lot of money. And so she had no resources, and so we went from being among the relatively well-to-do people in this town to being about the poorest people in the town. My mother had no sense of economy. I didn't have a sense of deprivation at all, but the reason for telling the story is because I went to a small Quaker school. And this Quaker school, I was part of its largest graduating class in history, which was 38 people. The class ahead of me was 18, the class behind me was 15. And it was a day school. It wasn't a boarding school. After my father died, my mother couldn't afford to keep me at the school. And so she's about to take me out. And I became then the first scholarship student at the school in return for working weekends in the summer. They waived my tuition. And this Quaker school was, in fact, my salvation. It was a surrogate mother and father to me. And I think that my academic achievements come in part from having, my mother was an alcoholic, I might add too, although I didn't know it at the time, but she didn't function very well. So the school became a very important focus.
Was it a boarding school or
a day school?
Day school.
A day school. And I think that pleasing those teachers became a very important part of my standing in the world and my sense of myself. And I think I was a good student in part because I wanted to please these teachers. The other thing to be said about this Quaker school is they did things that a public school or a grammar school, government school, couldn't possibly have done. That is to say, we had things like week-long work camps in Philadelphia, and we would go and work with a black slum family painting and plastering their house. We would go to dock worker meetings. We would go to Communist Party meetings, front organizations. We would eat at settlement houses, people off the street. We would visit prisons. We would visit the state mental institutions. We, in a sense, got a chance as 12, 13, 14, 15-year-olds to see the kind of underbelly of Philadelphia in a way that no government school would have possibly been able to allow their students to do without a lot of trouble. It was voluntary to do this. And so I think that the Quakers, they also at that time, of course, had a lot of people who were conscientious objectors during the Second World War, which was an extremely unpopular way to conduct yourself. And they taught me, for which I'm everlastingly grateful, or they put in front of me, if you like, people every day who had the capacity to stand up in a crowd of 100 and be a minority of one. And that kind of Quaker courage actually was infectious to me. So I have taken that on board. So if you want me to stand up in a crowd of 100 and be a minority of one, I'm your man. On the other hand, I'm completely not brave in other ways. So if you show me the instruments of torture, I will betray my family, my children, and anyone else in the room, I think. So, but at that kind of bravery, that kind of civic bravery, I found impressive, and it had a great deal of influence on me.
Right. Lots of things come out of that. I mean, just not to miss the opportunity, obviously, and perhaps we'll come back to this later, your interest in what's in India called subaltern studies, i.e., well, the weapons of the weak and all this, seems so obviously related to the fact that you were seeing people in prisons and marginalized people from very early on, and seeing that they were humans and that they were striving against authority.
Right, and although I briefly became a Quaker, but I consider myself to be a lapsed Quaker, I rarely go to Quaker meetings. The Quaker doctrine of the light of God in every man, and the history of Quaker social action, whether it's in education for Native Americans, whether it's in assisting in the Underground Railroad and prison work, I admired the Quakers enormously for that, and that did rub off. And in fact, a book I wrote called Domination and the Arts of Resistance, I actually dedicated to Morristown Friends School, the name of the particular school, and devoted my royalties to the school, as well as a mark of the gratitude that I felt I owed them. And the nicest thing that's ever happened to me, I think, is there's someone named Alice Paul. In the struggle for women's suffrage in America, there were sort of 8 key women, most of whom were Quakers, and Alice Paul was one of them. She happened to be a graduate of my little school in the very, very early years, and they created Alice Paul Award. She was one of these people who they were force-fed. I think they went to prison and refused to eat for demonstrating, and they were force-fed. And the school created an award in the name of Alice Paul, and I was its first recipient, and I've never been as proud of anything. I didn't actually know who Alice Paul was until I got the award, but I was extremely proud of that. Where shall I go from here?
Well, let's go back, because being anthropologists in particular, I like to go back, if possible, even further than parents. Did you know your grandparents at all? Or what they did? Or?
Yes, I was. I didn't know my parents on my mother's side. My mother's side actually were kind of socially prominent in Philadelphia 2 generations before my mother, and then the generation before my mother, and continuing into my mother's generation, is as if they all received a signal from God to drink themselves to death, and they did. More or less. So they completely died out, and I think my mother's mother died in childbirth, and so she was adopted by her uncle and her aunt, and I heard fond stories about her adopted father, her uncle, but I never met him. And I did, however, a force in my life, I suppose, was my grandmother and grandfather on my father's side. They were from a were from West Virginia, of sort of Scottish Welsh background, Parry, Salmons, and so on. And my grandmother was one of those classical Methodist striving. I recognized her in E.P. Thompson's chapter on Methodism as making of the working class. But she strived for the success of all her children, growing up in West Virginia with almost no money. And my grandfather was a salesman to mining stores and could live anywhere in his territory. And she decided that they ought to live in Morgantown, West Virginia, which is the place where the University of West Virginia is located. They built a big brick house, and they became a boarding house for junior professors whose laundry they did, and whom they fed, and all of her 5 children went to the University of West Virginia. And she drove them all. She was the kind of person who, if you got 5 A's and a B, would criticize you for the B rather than praising you for the A. And all the children disliked her, actually, but they realized how responsible she was for the success they achieved in life. And she had aspirations. So she was obviously one of these women who would have probably done very well had it been a time when she could have had a career of her own, but whose substitute for the career was writing poetry, being active locally, driving her children to distraction, and so on. And I was kind of apple of her eye, and I think she lived long enough to see me graduate from Williams College. And it was a mixed blessing because not many of her kids liked her all that much. But I was conscious of being the apple of her eye, and that it meant something to her for me to achieve some academic excellence. So that coal mining West Virginia hard scrabble striving that I suppose one could find in the coal country of Wales as well at the same time was an important part. And I think for my father, my mother was fond of pointing out that my father's dream was that one of his children would go to Harvard. Well, I never went to Harvard, but I did okay.
Yeah. Let's, just finally, you didn't have brothers or sisters? Or
I did. I have an older brother.
Yeah.
I have an older brother. It's a complicated story in the sense that my older brother, whom I actually adore, has had a working class life. And it turned out that he went to a small Quaker school as well, not the same one, and was naturally left-handed. And they insisted that he write with his right hand, and it had the result that I guess it has in many such cases. It gave him a terrible speech defect. And the speech defect sapped his confidence in the world, and he didn't do well in school, and ended up being either the lowest level of management or the highest member of the working class in a factory, doing tests for the quality of colors in a factory that made plastics. And so he was 9 years older than I am, and fought in the Korean War, and had, to show you the difference in our lives, he had not been on a plane in 30 years, and I took him to Korea to revisit the battlefields and his military history in Korea, and he was delighted at that, but it was the first time he's ever been out of the country except for having been on a troop ship to Korea. So I do have a brother, but he's had a very different life than I.
And just to finish off on those things, you mentioned your mother was alcoholic, but you didn't realize it. I mean, must have affected her treatment and behavior towards you?
Yes.
What sort of person was she? I'm putting it in another way.
Well, as I said, she'd been brought up in a rather privileged way, and it meant that she didn't really have any skills. So she was completely dependent on my father, deeply in love with him, but in a dependent way. And she tried to commit suicide in the month or so after my father's death by an overdose of pills. I didn't know this at the time, but I was sent to go live with another uncle and aunt in West Virginia, actually. I was with them for 6 weeks till my mother recovered and came back. And my mother basically held herself together and controlled her drinking by and large until I went off to college. And then when I went off to college, she more or less collapsed and was in and out of treatment and eventually died, I think, when I was in the beginning of graduate school. And it was, it certainly gave me the realization that women who didn't have an independent source of self-esteem and a skill were in trouble in the world in terms of what they had to fall back on when family and external income was no longer there. So it affected my idea of the kind of relationship I wanted to have and the kind of woman with whom I thought I could have a successful relationship. It's also, I think, for any, I know there are support groups for people who live in alcoholic families these days, in which people know a lot more than I knew at the time, but there was none of that available to me. But I did eventually I did what most people are advised to do in situations like that. That is to say, when I went to college and my mother was being treated again and again for alcoholism, we would have crying, screaming, confrontations, and so on, all of which were, ultimately failures in terms of getting her to stop drinking. And at a certain point, after 4 or 5 years of these futile confrontations, I remember looking at my mother and realizing that I could not change her behavior and that this was destroying me. And I can actually remember it. Maybe it's exaggerating a bit to say that it happened overnight or it was a particular moment, but I can remember very quickly withdrawing and seeing my mother as a sad victim and with an objective eye in which I emotionally detached myself. And I think it was the way to save me, but it's not something that I liked about myself, though it was a necessary survival move, and one that's, I gather, recommended in contemporary therapy. There's a part of me that didn't like the idea that I now saw my mother as an objective victim in the world and not someone whose fate and suffering I had distanced myself from emotionally. So I think you pay a price in coldness and withdrawal from that.
It's a very frank and good answer and very helpful. I learned a lot from interviewing Clifford Geertz about Clifford from his account of his very difficult childhood, which is not dissimilar from what you've described.
Oh yes, I know a little bit about this myself.
And your father, just to finally finish, I mean, he died when you were 9. Were you close to him up to that point in March?
Yes, I was very close to him. As a matter of fact, these were the old days when doctors went around and paid house calls. My father had a sort of red roadster, and he took every opportunity to take me with him in the afternoons when I was out of school to go visit patients and so on. I spent a lot of time with him and came to admire him. He was, how shall I say, he was a sort of bon vivant, but and like my mother, actually, one of their great characteristics is that they actually believed that the world is divided into large-spirited people and small-spirited people, and I believe that if you're ever going to make a mistake, it should always be the large-spirited mistake, because people will always forgive you if you give them a present that's too big, if you tell someone you love them and it's not quite it. Those are always forgiven, but if you make a small-spirited mistake, so my father and mother, the one thing that they bequeathed me somehow is a sort of over-the-top large-spiritedness. So my mother, for all her alcoholism, would have kind of given away the house to the next beggar who came to the back door, and I found that. And my father was an authoritarian personality as well. So when my brother came back from his Quaker school knitting blankets for the poor Europeans after the Second World War, my father took him out of the Quaker school thinking he was going to become gay and sent him to a military school, which is absolutely the worst possible thing he could have done for my brother. And I can remember once he treated a man for lip cancer, I think, and we were driving along, and this man was a farmer. He saw the man on his tractor smoking his pipe. And my father just stopped the car, walked halfway across the field, climbed up on the tractor, took the man's pipe and broke it over his knee without saying a word, and walked back to the car in silence. So you get some idea for the kind of motto I had. Right?
Yeah. This was a country town, presumably. So, what were your hobbies, and what were you doing? Were you a rambler, a collector of objects?
Well, I was a completely avid stamp collector. I had some friends who did stamp collecting. I was partly in loyalty to my father. My father was a Franklin Roosevelt supporter, enthusiastic supporter, and out of loyalty to him, I somehow identified with the Democratic Party and the New Deal at a very early age. So I was actually involved in local Democratic politics even as a young kid. Had what we would call, what's the word, pork barrel jobs, working at the Unemployment Compensation Office through the Democratic Party. And the other, the fact is I actually had to work all the time. So by the time I was 11, my mother and I were loading lawnmowers in the back of the car, and I was mowing people's lawn, I was doing their gardening, I was working for the Quaker school in the summer, I worked at a machine shop at nights on school days, doing metal fittings for this or that. And so, and whenever it snowed, another friend and I would spend all the time we could manage shoveling snow. So I was literally I worked, and that continued all the way through college as a scholarship boy.
This started when you were 9, when your father died and you needed the money. Yeah.
That's right. So I had some, even though I later come to agriculture and animal husbandry, I could say, the fact is my agricultural experience was picking corn and peaches and tomatoes and green beans and cherries, but stoop labor along with the Puerto Ricans who came to work. And it turned out that my part of New Jersey, one doesn't think of New Jersey as an agricultural area, but the fact is the waste of New Jersey is actually very rich agricultural land, and there were lots and lots. Well, my mother grew up on a farm outside this town, and so I did a lot of agricultural labor, but it wasn't the labor that brought me to agriculture. I can't say honestly that I enjoyed it. It was a necessary way of earning money.
Returning to the school, you said how important it was. From what age did you go to this Quaker school? I mean,
from second grade, which would have been age 7,
until
end of high school.
Oh, right.
So
7 to 17.
And it was a tiny school, so it meant that I don't know about your own historical experience in school, but people that you know from age 6 until 17 or 18, I feel, I've been to a couple of reunions, I know these people right down to the black little marrow of their bones. I know everything about them. I saw them every day, year after year after year, and I know them a lot more, I think, than I know people who I'm very close to as an adult in some way. And of course, it's the same the other way around. They know me, and it's, I find that very comforting, actually. I avoid reunions, but I found that the 2 times I have gone to such reunions, it's extremely satisfying to know that behind all the wrinkles and so on, there's that essential person that I recall from.
Have you remained friends with any of them in the sense of corresponding and meeting up with them otherwise?
Yeah, 2 or 3 of them. Especially those of, especially those of us who've had comparable lives. So one of my friends went to Yale as an undergraduate, written some books on Italian cinema and so on, and he was a dear friend in school, and also came from a Quaker family, so I had stayed overnight with him a lot. He's getting the second Alice Paul Award in a month or so. And there are a couple of other people to whom I was close. One became a veterinarian, and the other became actually a rather good, nearly professional women's soccer player, and then ran a successful business. And so I keep in touch with these people whom I'm rather fond of.
I didn't realise when you mentioned the Alice Paul Award there, this was given to you recently. It wasn't an award you got when you were at school.
No. This was 5 or 6 years ago.
Oh, I see.
4 or 5 years ago.
Then it makes it special. Not
So yes, right.
Were there any? Do you remember any of the names and the influences of any of the teachers at that school? Doesn't matter so much about the names, but was there anyone who particularly infused you, inspired you? It's obviously there weren't many teachers there.
Yes, it was. This was the world before there was career counseling and a special, special people whose job it was to figure out where people ought to go for higher education. And I didn't have a clue, nor did my mother have a clue. And although I'd done very well at school, I happened to have a Latin teacher whom I liked a lot. And he had gone to Williams College. And I decided to go to Williams College because he'd been to Williams College and I rather liked him. Otherwise, the other alternative was to go to Haverford or Swarthmore, which were much closer, just outside Philadelphia. Quaker schools. And the fact is, I wanted to put as much distance between myself and my mother as it was possible under the circumstances. And Williams gave me a scholarship, and so I went to Williams. I don't regret having gone to Williams. It was, at the time, I was an economics major and political economy, a double major, and it had, and still has, I think, the best small college economics program in the country. So I got a fabulous education. I arrived thinking that I was badly trained. I can remember that my brother brought me to the first day of my freshman year, and I realized that I was completely inappropriately dressed in a sort of New Jersey high school kind of way, and I hadn't even been next to a tweed jacket. And I remember sitting down in a room where people who had just arrived as well, and who were freshmen, were talking about artists and writers and poets whom I didn't even know of, let alone have an opinion to contribute. And I thought, I am truly out of my league. I'm not going to survive here. And I remember calling my mother and saying, Ma, I'll do my best, but I'll probably be home before Christmas. I don't think I can hack it here. And it was a rich kids' school, and I was uncomfortable socially at the school. It was also all men at the time, and it took me about 3 years before I decided that I belonged intellectually and was doing well. And here I might connect this to the reason why I'm a Southeast Asianist, and when I say creating false narratives of continuity, just to show you what I had in mind. So I had an economics professor Neil Dupre, who was a great professor, only wrote 2 or 3 articles, but they were quite famous articles. And he had, in casting around for a problem to hurl myself at as an economics honor student, it turned out, I guess, that Germany in the early years of the war, when it had the manpower, didn't run double or triple shifts when it could have in its factories. And my job was to figure out why they didn't. And I knew enough German to make a stab at it. But it happened to be after 3 years of working night and day at Williams, in which I finally decided that I belonged, that I was reasonably bright. And I relaxed for the first time to the point of falling in love and not doing any work in much the fall. And I went in to see this professor, and he said, he asked me what I'd done, and I tried to bamboozle him. I hadn't done much, and he saw right through me, and he said, "Get out. You're not doing an honors thesis with me. You haven't done any work. You don't know what you're talking about. Get out." And so I realized that if I was going to graduate with honors, I had to find someone to adopt me. And so the next day, screwing up my courage, I knocked at the door of all the other economists at Williams. There weren't many of them. And finally, the 3rd or 4th door I knocked at was a William Hollinger who had worked on Indonesia. And he said, "You know, I've always wanted to know something about the economic development of Burma. If you'll work on Burma, I'll adopt you." And I said, "Fine." And under my breath, "Where the hell is Burma?" Because I truly didn't know where Burma was. And so I ended up doing an honors thesis on Burmese economic development. And in the meantime, applying to Harvard Law School, because I didn't know what I was going to do with my life. And so I got accepted at Harvard Law School. And then I won a lark. I applied for a Rotary Fellowship to Burma. And lo and behold, I got it. And so I thought, I can always go to Harvard Law School, but when am I going to go to Burma? So I went to Burma for a year. Then...
You're going too fast.
Yep.
Whizzing through your life too fast. There are lots of things. I want to go back to school even.
Sure.
Because you won't know, but I have a kind of agenda of things I like to.
Sure.
At school, I like to cover, if possible, sort of peripheral interests, and in particular, whether you had any interest in music at any time. Played it, listened to it, or whether it's important to you now. That's one of the things. Because that's the time often where one learns an instrument.
The short answer is no. My parents had, my mother in particular, but my father too, had aspirations for at least a stab at music in the way in which, the piano in the parlor was a mark of middle-class status, and I had piano lessons, and I still have the first 16 measures of Grieg's Concerto in A minor, which I could do, and that's it. And in fact, I was not happy practicing the piano. I can remember we had a grandfather's clock, not unlike the one out in the other room. Was it Foster's clock?
Foster's clock.
And when my mother was in the kitchen, I would sneak up to the clock and move it 10 minutes ahead to minimize my practice time. And then I would have to find another time to put it back so that it didn't just get ahead. So the fact is that I regret. I later took up the guitar. I'm very fond of listening to music, but I don't think I have a great deal of talent. What I do is but that's late too, do a lot of pastel drawing and painting. So I think actually I'm in complete envy of people who have at an early age developed either a musical skill or an artistic skill, and something to which I still aspire.
Do you listen to a lot of music, and what music do you listen to?
I do, and I also mostly to Baroque music. My partner is a cellist, and I can listen to her play Bach suites till the cows come home. And my wife, as I said, who died 12 years ago, she got a kind of classical education, and I was, I think, a civilizational project of hers that was relatively successful. So seriously, so she brought me to opera. She was an art historian. She brought me to art, and just living with her for 30 years or so was a kind of intellectual and artistic formation that was remarkable for me. So I, in a sense, embraced all of her enthusiasms and ended up becoming fond of the things that she was fond of. But I don't think, as a high school kid, I think I was far too anxious about whether our family was going to sink financially into the mud, or whether I was going to do all right in school. I think the sense of the wolf at the door was with me for quite a long time until I realized that my existential worries were greater than they need be.
What about sports and games?
I was very fond of sports. I was a goalkeeper in soccer. Since it was a Quaker school, we didn't play violent sports like American football. We played soccer, and we were rather good at it. Actually, we had a actually undefeated basketball season and a all but one game undefeated soccer season. But the match we lost was lost by me in a penalty kick that went through my legs, which everyone in my school remembers. It was the humiliation of my high school career. But I continued to play. I play basketball with my children, who are now, in their early 40s, and so I'm quite. I don't think I'm a great. I'm not a very good athlete. In fact, if truth be told, I don't think I'm naturally adept at anything in particular, but I tend to make up for it by brute fascist persistence. For example, I'm learning Burmese now. It's hard. I started that when I was 66 to really hurl myself with Burmese. And ordinarily I'm not a great language student. I'm okay. But I find, I've learned a lot of languages, and I find that sheer persistent application will get you any language you like, right? If you just don't quit. And so I think, I'm an all-around mediocre talent with a lot of aspirations and endless energy and persistence.
Right. Well, perhaps the last thing you touched on it, but it's always interesting to reflect more on. You mentioned the Quaker background, and at school, 15, 16, 17 is often a time when one either takes to religion or rejects one's religion. How would you characterize your religious trajectory?
That's not only an astute question, but it happens to be fairly important. My father was an atheist. I mean, not just a quiet atheist, but a militant atheist. And I can remember going with my father to see an elderly man who was dying of cancer, who my father couldn't do much for except ease the pain. But I would go with my father. I saw this man with my father maybe 5 or 6 times before he died. And my father would just sit and talk with him for 30 minutes or 40 minutes and actually try to talk him out of his faith. At the end of this poor man's life, and my father didn't like the idea. It was a pleasant and even affectionate conversation, but my father didn't like the idea that this man was going to his grave with these illusions. And so that's the kind of atheist my father was, and my mother was an agnostic. But they didn't have the courage of their convictions, so that they insisted that I go to Sunday school somewhere, although the Catholic Church was not on the menu. And so they drove me around, literally. It was a little town. There were 5 or 6 little churches. And there were some nice trees outside the Presbyterian church. And so I decided to go there. And I actually liked singing. It was a sort of, child tenor. I was child soprano almost. And then I became the Episcopalian, a.k.a. Anglican Church priest at the Episcopalian church and was very fond of him. And had a good friend who my age, and we were both fond of him. And so I became, this is when I was, of course, all this time I was at the Quaker school too. I became an Episcopalian, was confirmed, altar boy, not eating before communion. This went on for about 2 hours, and
2 hours?
2 years. 2 hours for 2 years.
Yeah.
And there is this, I don't know if this tradition exists here, of Sunday school, which is like a class, and the older kids, among whom I was, had our Sunday school with the priest. And I was, thanks to the Quakers, completely taken up with Gandhi. And I asked whether Gandhi could go to the Episcopalian heaven. And the doctrine, at least then, was that if you had known about Jesus Christ, you might have a sporty chance of going to heaven, because, but if Gandhi knew about Jesus Christ and did not accept him as his Lord and Savior, and therefore there was no place in the Episcopalian heaven for Gandhi. And I said, well, that's it for me. I don't want any part of the heaven that doesn't have a place for Gandhi. And I walked out of the Sunday school. My friend walked out with me.
How old were you then?
Oh, I would have been 15, I think, 15 or 16. And I remained quite fond of the priest. Didn't hold it against me. We still shoveled snow for him and had long talks, so he was perfectly gracious about this. But that was the end of my, because I was very into being a good altar boy and a good Episcopalian until then.
And now? Or in the subsequent years? I mean...
No, I became, I think, after... I taught at the University of Wisconsin for 8 years, and there I decided to, as a way of having a kind of community when we first arrived, joining Quaker meeting there. And I went fairly religiously for a while. And then one reason or another sort of lapsed. And I actually, I don't think, although the Quaker, social gospel of Quakerism, I have, although I admire the Quaker social gospel, I don't have any faith in a higher being, and I find it, a little, I find it difficult to, I don't believe Pascal, that, just, if you don't have faith, just get down on your knees 5 times a day and the faith will come. I find that a bad faith performance. And so, no, I'm actually, I suppose if I thought it were a matter of great moment, I would be an atheist, but I don't much care about my lack of faith. And so I suppose you would have to put me in the agnostic column. I actually saw a bumper sticker that I rather was enamored by a year or two ago. It said, militant agnostic. And afterwards it said, I don't know and you don't either. And I thought, this is a bumper sticker that I could subscribe to. So the answer is I don't. I don't have any religious faith, I don't think.
You've worked mainly in societies which have a lot of Buddhism in them. I mean, do you admire Buddhists?
No, actually, I know it's doesn't sound. I find it actually astounding that I've seen Buddhism in action, and although I am greatly admiring of individual Buddhist figures and their acceptance and their distance and their benevolence. I actually find that it is I see Burma, if you like, on its back as a country. And I see Buddhist figures who individually may actually do some very valuable things in orphanages and so on. But in a sense, the quicker social action that creates civil society and provides kind of passion behind it. I don't see this in Buddhism. I find it an extremely individualistic form of religion, and I somehow, I'm sure you followed the events of September and so on, and I found myself wondering how a different kind of Buddhism might have been able to bring about more successful results than the Buddhism the Theravada Buddhism. Mahayana Buddhism is rather different, perhaps, and Tantric Buddhism may be rather different as well. But no, I'm not, and I was prepared. I was prepared to be, and I spent a lot of time in Watts and Abbeys, because it's a great way of seeing the country, and these people have connections. But no, I'm not taken the way so many Westerners are by meditation and so on.
Thank you. Let's get then back to Williams College. You mentioned the economists who taught you. Were there any other people at that stage who you became friends with or who influenced you a lot?
Yes. I was always, if you like, having lost my own father, always on the lookout for father figures whom I could admire and whom I would want to be like. I was taken under the wing of two people in the political science department, actually. A guy named Frederick Schumann, who wrote a book on international relations, and his nickname at Williams was Red Fred. And there were alumni who refused to give money to the college until they retired. And I found his left-wing politics to my very satisfying. And I think I took attendance at his large lecture classes as one of my scholarship student duties for which I was paid, and he got to know me as a poor scholarship student who did well, and so he took me under his wing, as I should say. And another professor who was, I think, as a teacher, luminous he was a Straussian from Chicago named Robert Gaudino, died at a very young age, and but he took the Socratic method enormously seriously and had these tiny classes that were filled with a kind of intellectual tension in which you were expected to be deeply engaged with your kind of whole brain and whole sense of feeling. And I can remember them as being rather frightening in terms of what was expected from me in terms of engagement in the classroom. And I remember there were some trustees who came. We were in a sort of elegant little room of a house, and the trustees came for a meeting, and I remember him going in a purposefully dramatic way. When they came through the hallway, he went to the door and shut the door and said, "They must never hear what we say here." And he actually, he was a kind of small genius. I don't think much of Straussianism generally, but he as a teacher was quite remarkable. And one of the things that he did was there was a Williams in India program, And it took Williams undergraduates, and I didn't participate. This began actually after I was there. And they would live in a village in India for 6 months, and they would prepare themselves by reading and so on. And after about 5 years of this enormously successful program, they realized that most Williams students, many of them from very genteel backgrounds, actually knew more about India now than they knew about their own country. And out of this developed a Williams in America program in which people would, the undergraduates would prepare to spend a semester living with a greengrocer family, with an auto worker's family, and so on, or working at a hospital or a firehouse and as a public institution in a small place. And it was a completely brilliant program, because I have a feeling that none of these Williams graduates who came, many of them from the thin air stratosphere of the social stratification, after an experience like this, none of them would have had something facile to say about the petty bourgeoisie or something facile to say about auto workers, because they actually had at least lived that life. And I think that kind of, that's in part the anthropology connection. Right?
Did you go on any of these things yourself?
No, I did, of course, do the Quaker things in Philadelphia that I mentioned. But when I came back from Burma after that year, and when I began graduate school, I was a student political activist, and I worked for the National Student Association in Paris for a year, going to student meetings as a representative of this left-wing National Student Association. And then I was elected to an office in the NUS here in Britain for another year. And then I went to graduate school. But when I went to graduate school, it was clear to me that I knew some Burmese then, but I knew I couldn't go to Burma. Burma had closed up then.
When did you first go to Burma? What year was it?
1961 when I started graduate school.
Tell me something about that year, because it's pretty important. The first arrival or vivid memories of. Were you where were you in Burma?
Oh, about a year in Burma.
Rangoon?
I was in Rangoon. I got involved in student politics with a lot of minority groups. I was very active in student politics, and I took this to Burma. And I actually, after 3 months or so, I got a death threat put under my door. I lived in something called the Old Staff Chummery at the University of Rangoon, and it said, "We're going to kill you." And the Rangoon University Students' Union was a kind of hotbed of radical politics, and as I said, I'm not brave in that sense. And so, within a week or so, I moved to Mandalay and went to the University of Mandalay, to the new staff chummery there. Spent the rest of the year there working on, I thought I was doing economic statistics, but it turned out that statistics were completely unreliable. And after 3 months of trying to redo the statistical series, I thought, this is a crazy way to spend a year in Burma sitting in my room working at statistical techniques. And so I quit that and traveled the country and tried to learn some Burmese in the 3 months that were left to me. And I think that I feel that I bungled that year. And the book that I've just done now, and the time I've spent in Burma, is in a sense an effort to do Burma right, to do Burma justice. And I might add, this is a theme of my life, that my dissertation, called Political Ideology in Malaysia, that no one knows about, and correctly so, was not a good book. It pleased my professors. It was published. On the other hand, it didn't please the area specialists, the people who knew about Malaysia. And so Weapons of the Week was, in a sense, an effort to do Malaysia right after having bungled it the first time. And one could say the same about Burma. So it was my first time abroad. And it was really hard. I lost something like 35 pounds in the course of the year. Came back rail thin. And
did you find it must have found it a beautiful place? I mean, Mandalay, although much of it had been destroyed, of course, there were still many temples, and there was the Irrawaddy and so on.
Yes, and it was. I can still remember the water festival in Mandalay. I found it, completely enchanting. I mean, I was perfectly happy then to devote the rest of my life to Burmese studies, and if I had been able to study Burma with the assurance that I could go to Burma, that's probably what I would have done. And my next choice was Chinese, but you couldn't go to China either. And so then I decided, well, if I study Malay Indonesian, it gives you 4 countries, because it's not only spoken in Malaysia and Indonesia, but in parts of the Philippines and Thailand as well. So one of these countries is going to be open to me. And so that's essentially, it was practical considerations like that led me to study Indonesian.
So you moved from Williams College to, or did you come back and do research at Williams College? I mean, when you came back to do a further degree.
Oh, I came back to Yale.
To Yale.
I came back to Yale. So the sequence, although I'm not sure how important it is, I was going to go to Harvard Law School, and I postponed Harvard Law School for my year in Burma. And then, after a year in Burma, I realized I did not want to be a lawyer. And I decided that I would like to be an economist. And so I applied to the Yale economics department. They accepted me. And then I had a chance to go to Paris and spend a year as a representative of the National Student Association, to meetings in Africa and so on. And then I realized in the course of that year, taking some courses at Sciences Po, that I wanted to be an economist, but they required me to go and take a couple of years of advanced calculus. I had first year calculus, and I didn't want to. I had a chance to go to North Africa as part of a trade union delegation. So I asked them if they could allow me to do the calculus in connection with my first semester. And James Tobin, who was chairman then, said no. And I appealed, and he still said no. And then I said, well, why don't you send all my things over to the political science department and see if they'll have me. And they did, and political science accepted me, and I went to North Africa and then became a political scientist rather than an economist. So Burma and political science are both vastly contingent events.
And Paris, you were, 22, 23 or something like that?
I was at Langue Orientale and Sciences Po. I wasn't a serious student. I was busy running around to international student meetings for the National Student Association. It was great. It was a fabulous year. It was a kind of, the cosmopolitanization of Jim Scott. And so I didn't realize it at the time, but it just gave me a familiarity. Huge international student community in Paris at the time, exciting time to be there, and it gave me also a appropriately jaundiced view of political science, which was then in the middle of its positivist, empiricist. I mean, you know these people, Bob Lane and Robert Dahl and Ed Lindblom, and though I admire them all, it was a moment in American political science.
But they weren't in Paris. You were reading them in Paris.
No, I didn't read them until I didn't know a thing about them. I was trained traditionally at Williams. I didn't know anything about the behavioral revolution when I arrived at Yale. All of this was complete news to me. In fact, I felt all these people, even though that's not the work they did, were like Jesuits in the grip of a view of how intellectual progress could be made that I didn't share, mastered what they want me to master before I feel free to rebel. So it took me about a year and a half or so before I essentially rejected what they were teaching. But
Right, so we're now starting your, was it a PhD that you were doing? Yeah, and what was the title or theme of it? It was on Malaysia.
oh, well, I was, apropos of mesmerized by a father figure. Bob Lane was my thesis supervisor, and he had done this book called, I think, I'm blocking on its title. In any case, I was very impressed. It was, he had had long 16-hour interviews, which this pales to insignificance. 16-hour interviews with working class New Haven people about how they thought about politics. And they were, I thought, deep and searching, and he had a kind of literary flair, did Bob Lane. And
How do you spell his name?
Robert Lane, Lane,
yeah.
And I think it was called maybe Political Theology, maybe.
Mm.
And I thought it was a good book. It has sunk without a trace, I think. And I like the technique of deep and searching interviews of that kind of depth. And so I did this with high civil servants in Malaysia. Interviewed maybe 15 or 16 of them, each of them for several hours, and put together something called Political Ideology in Malaysia. And it was, I think that it was a good example of someone who wants to imitate his professor, and it was a successful imitation. I think the distinction was very highly thought of, was immediately published, and reviewed badly by and large. And I realized that I was easily flattered by the people who were closest to my work, and I had no distance, and that political science had, in a sense, I had the basis for a class action suit against political science for having bungled my education and mesmerized me in this way, and that I realized then that I did not want to do any work that was essentially based exclusively in a kind of narrow, hyper-specialized discipline. And so I then did some work on corruption, which I had actually started in Malaysia, and did a book called Comparative Political Corruption, which I think is a fine little book. But that was before Moral Economy of the Peasant, which probably kind of started me.
What was wrong with political science? I mean, this isn't grand political science. It's not sort of Montesquieu and de Tocqueville kind of level. It's applied American political science in the 1950s, 60s. Right.
Yes, well, yes, you said it. This was a sort of minor genre painting in that tradition. But what I was doing was, filling in the cells of a grid created by somebody else, and without a great deal of imagination. And in the meantime, I think the effect of all of this, the year in Paris, I was married when I began graduate school, and so the civilization project had started to kick in, as it were. And so I think by the time I finished my dissertation, I in part knew that this was not what I might aspire to. And so, I mean, I think that if I were able to stand over you and put a pistol to your head and force you to read my dissertation, you would agree with me that this was not a very distinguished piece of work. And maybe in my case, maybe I had to do that in order to aspire to something rather more broad and ambitious, and so on and So well, you know, of course, there is that particular empiricist, positivist political science, A.J. Ayer inspired among others, was, I think, produced in general, kind of work of survey research that doesn't hold up as very distinguished in the long run.
But were you not influenced by some of those great American sociologists of that time? I mean, Wright Mills, Barrington Moore, David Reisman, and so on.
I read Reisman and C. Wright Mills and was influenced by, particularly by C. Wright Mills. But so my education begins, if you like, as someone who frames questions in a way that doesn't depend on the discipline so desperately, is when I start to teach at Madison, Wisconsin in 1967. I'm a Southeast Asianist. The Vietnam War is at its height. There are demonstrations every day at the University of Wisconsin, tear gas, etc. And I find myself teaching courses on the Vietnam War with 800 students. Maybe I taught with a friend who's a China specialist named Ed Friedman. We taught, of course, on Peasant Revolution, and we had 800 students. And to give you a sense for how much it mattered to people then, we would give a lecture, and 60 or 70 students who thought we were insufficiently progressive would go away after the lecture and write a 5 or 6 page rebuttal of our lecture, which they would hand out to all the students at the next meeting of the class. And this went on through the whole semester. Right? It's quite extraordinary when there weren't demonstrations that canceled the class altogether. And so it was clear to me. I got into deep trouble as an anti-war person at Wisconsin, and there was a dean who wanted desperately to get rid of me. And I had gone to Wisconsin because I know it had protected its people against McCarthy and so on. So Wisconsin had this progressive tradition from the Leverhulme period that I had a lot of respect for. And in the end, it sort of saved me, I think. But I thought, at that point then, it seemed to me to be the most important thing I could possibly do at my time, to understand peasant politics and understand peasant revolution and wars of national liberation. And so I then hurled myself at reading everything I could get on Vietnamese peasant politics, the history of peasant protest movements, kind of colonial taxation, agrarian, and so this was a completely, if you like, stimulated by the current political situation in which I found myself, but determined to somehow make something serious intellectually of it. And Barrington Moore was, at that point, extremely important because he at least tried to understand these different routes to modernity and their relationship to the way in which commercial agriculture was created and agrarian elite classes were created. And I found it very persuasive, deeply influenced by that. In fact, and Friedman and I wrote the introduction to a rather more recent edition of Barrington Moore's work. And so that was a point where, if you like, my intellectual agenda was increasingly less dependent on political science. In fact, in my department at Yale, although people like Ian Shapiro, people I respect in the department, they like me, find me a nice ornament in political science. But I think most of my other colleagues don't consider me to be a real political scientist. And if you ask people who didn't know this what I was, most people would say I'm an anthropologist. That's why we're having this interview, among other things, right?
But when you wrote me an email, you say, of course, I'm not really an anthropologist, I'm a political scientist.
Well, that's an affectation. I like the idea of not being right. a legitimate member of any.
Yes, this is what I thought.
profession. Right. So,
I was guessing that. Someone, I mean, at that time, may not want to talk about this, but there was a famous article by Eric Wolf, I think it was called something like Anthropologists on the Warpath, about the involvement of anthropologists in the Vietnam War as consultants. Which is
sure.
Did you get involved in that?
I was very much involved in that. In fact, I had. This is it's complicated. It hasn't come up, but it's completely relevant here. So, when I worked for the National Student Association, it turned out, after I was elected to be vice president, international vice president of the American Political Science, National Student Association, I was delivering some resolutions we passed at our annual student meeting on Haiti and other places in Washington. And I was asked to go to a meeting with someone who turned out to be a CIA agent who wanted me to write reports for the CIA. And at the time, I don't think I was ideologically opposed to that, but it seemed too cloak and dagger for me, and so I refused. And it turned out that during my year working for the National Student Association, all my reports were sent by the president, who had been recruited by the CIA to the CIA. So I, in effect, wasn't paid, but was an effective CIA agent. So I had some sense for having been a little cog in a machine I didn't much care for. And so the idea that anthropologists should be involved in counterinsurgency, which is an issue, by the way, that's come up again.
I was going to say,
as you know, this is something that it was clear to me that this must never happen. And I knew some of the people, David Wilson, was on the Tribal Research Center in Thailand, actually a number of quite distinguished scholars whose work is actually quite good. And so I was very heavily involved in this, and very heavily involved in the kind of protests against, I don't know, Sam Huntington was involved then, and he wrote an article called Getting Ready for Political Competition in Vietnam. And its argument essentially was that people who were relocated because of bombing were deprived of their natural social networks of solidarity and coordination, and that they were more easily mobilizable to vote for candidates that the American military might favor. And the implication was that the more people relocated for bombing, the better our chances were. And so there was a huge demonstration at the Association of Asian Studies over Huntington's work. And I was very much a part of this. So, yes, you could say that there were at least 5 or 6 years of my life in Wisconsin devoted to both intellectual work that was against the war in Vietnam and also practical speaking against the war as well. So,
did you know Eric Wolf?
excuse me?
Did you know Eric Wolf?
I did, actually. I got to meet him a couple of times. And I remember, actually, I think before I met Eric Wolf, I met his wife, his second wife, I guess, Sidel Silverman.
Oh, yes.
We were at some meeting together, and I was talking about Eric Wolf to her, not knowing she was married to him. She said, "Oh, I'm married to Eric Wolf." And I said, I thought she was joking, and I said, "Oh, yes, and I'm married to Margaret Mead." And it turned out, of course, that she was married to Eric Wolf. And yes, I think Peasant Wars of the 20th Century, and his little book on peasants. And of course, if you take a look at the book that's coming out in September, it starts out with Pierre Closter's argument about the difference between people with history and people without history, and it can be seen as an homage to Eric Wolf. I think Europe and the People Without History is a great little book.
Great big book.
Big book, it's true. It is fatter, isn't it? Most of it is, right? But I think he did an admirable he did an admirable job of, in a sense, taking the same political situation that I faced and doing a kind of scholarship that transcended just the particular moment that's still valuable to read.
Hmm. Well, the other person I immediately associate with doing a similar sort of thing and who has been interviewed for this series is Sidney Mintz. Do you know Sidney?
Never met Sidney Mintz. I've read, I think, everything he's written just about, and recently taught his Sweetness and Power last year. You know, I run a program in agrarian studies at
Yes.
have for 18 years, and so we had almost, well, Piers Vitebsky was just there a week or two ago, but we had everybody and anybody who works on agrarian issues, with the exception of Sidney Mintz, is on my list of things that we have not yet done yet.
Good. So you stayed at Wisconsin for about 6 years, did you?
8 years.
8
I
years.
was there for 8 years.
And were there times when you nearly had to leave, or they protected you enough to?
Well, a dean who had been head of the political science department of Wisconsin, you may have come across his name, is Leon Epstein. He was president of the Political Science Association. He was dean then. And since within a month after I arrived, we had almost all my full faculty meetings on the Vietnam War and the demonstrations on campus, and I spoke. And Leon Epstein decided I was a dangerous radical. And at a cocktail party one evening that fall, he said, I remember it well because my wife overheard it as well, and he said, "Scott, if we didn't need people like you and your ilk around here, we would get rid of," didn't quite finish the sentence. But it was clear that he, as dean, wanted to get rid of me. And so I actually, thanks to my friend Ed Friedman, who said, "Scott, you have to start acting like a Jew. That is, you're going to have to be, you have to be better than all these goyim in order to get to the same place, and you're going to have to be the perfect colleague, so that the only thing they can hold against you is your politics. And you're going to have to read everybody's papers, go to every meeting, and be an exemplary colleague, except for your political difference, so that they don't have something else." And so I did this, and finally, so I got tenure there, thanks to the support of some other people in the department. But when I was leaving, I had an offer from Yale, and my chairman in political science at Wisconsin said, "You must give us a chance to respond." And I said, "Our decision doesn't depend on how much money Wisconsin gives me. It depends on what Louise wants and some of the other conditions." And he said, "No, we have to have a chance to respond." Leon Epstein was still dean, and my counteroffer from Wisconsin was my proposed Yale salary minus $100. So the fine Italian hand of Leon Epstein was evident at the very end. And so I was very happy at Wisconsin, by the way. It had an agricultural school. I was working on peasants. Madison is a magnificent community. It's a huge university, lots of distinguished people. So I would have been happy to stay there. So I left all of this up to my wife, and all of her relatives were on the East Coast, and she had always wanted to be back on the East Coast. So we moved. And then my, in a sense, half-assed farming career began as well. So we moved into rural Connecticut, and I started accumulating sheep and goats.
We've now got to Yale. What was your position at Yale, and what were you doing there?
When I came to teach there,
Yeah. You're a tenured professor, obviously, because you've already got tenure. And you're a professor of political science, or?
yes, just political science. And then I think the reason they hired me is because they read the draft of Moral Economy of the Peasant, which was then in press, and thought it was a good book. And they happened to have money that had to be used for Southeast Asia. And there weren't too many of us, Southeast Asianists are not, in political science are not all that common. So I was hired on that premise, and I think that I would not have been hired at Yale had there not been money for Southeast Asia at the time. Partly because at that point the romance of the third world, I think when I went to Wisconsin, anybody who worked on the third world was considered to be appointable just simply for their exoticism. And I think by the time 1976, which is when I went to Yale, rolled around, that was no longer true. And so I think I was a long shot by the Yale department, and although I think they think that it was a good bet.
We'll come back to some of your activities later, but I really would like to cover your main books a little bit.
Sure.
Tell me, as you say, the Moral Economy of the Peasant was the first one that became internationally famous and very influential. I have to say that I've probably read bits of your work, but since almost every essay I ever set in that sort of area had summaries of your work, I feel I know your work rather well through bright students who were deeply impressed by it. But thinking about that, starting with that book, what was the main theme of it, and why was it such a outstanding, well, you can't say that, but I can say an outstanding contribution?
Well, the reason it became known is because someone decided to devote another book to attacking it. So Hopkins' book called The Rational Peasant, as if I had a theory of crazy or altruistic peasants. And so, in a sense, I think the book, it read well because, like most of my books, actually there's one point and which I hammer away at relentlessly in one way or another. So that many people have accused me of being wrong, but not many of not being comprehensible. And so, Moral Economy of the Peasant was essentially an argument about, if you like, almost rational choice. That is to say, that the problem of peasants was the danger of going under, and which the consequences are catastrophic. And so peasants both arrange, as agriculturalists, they choose different crops, different planting schedules, different soil conditions, and so on, and spread their bets in a series of prudent agronomic strategies so that they don't maximize their yield the way a modern capitalist would, but they minimize the danger of going under. And my argument was that they also have a whole series of social arrangements that do the same thing about the sharing of harvests, the forced charity within the village, the way in which if you want to become a big man, you have to distribute part of your surplus, and so on. But you had then a set of arrangements that were organized, again, not to maximize production, but to minimize the kind of social danger to individuals and to the community, and that these gradually broke down with capitalist markets, and they also broke down with colonial tax systems, in which the job of the colonial government, by and large, was to ensure themselves a regular revenue at the expense of the peasantry, whose yield fluctuated from time to time. And historically, traditional governments were weak enough so that they actually couldn't collect taxes very successfully in a bad year because peasants could resist fairly successfully. But under the colonial period, you had cash taxes and fixed revenue demands that didn't fluctuate with the harvest. And the result was that even a small crisis, a small crop failure, resulted in an existential crisis for the peasantry. And eventually, I wanted to study peasant rebellion. Remember, we're back at the Vietnam War, and I'm trying to understand why you have large-scale peasant wars. So that was that. And I think everyone was concerned with those issues, and the fact that Popkin wrote a book essentially criticizing my book meant that it was an ideal teaching vehicle for people who wanted to teach this conflict. And so I thought he was wasting his time writing a book about my book, and I told him so. But it turned out that it worked out we rose together as a debate that people found interesting to teach.
Chimed, or I don't know which was cause and which was effect, or whether it was just simultaneously, but in English social history at that time, particularly Edward Thompson wrote about the moral economy of the peasant.
Right.
And before him, someone, I don't know whether you have read, R.H. Tawney, who used the famous metaphor of the water up to the nose and then drowning. Tawney had, in the agrarian problem in the 16th century, had been concerned with this. Were you in touch with these historians?
Yes. In fact, my book, The Moral Economy of the Peasant, begins with Tawney's metaphor of the peasantry situation being like a man up to his chin in water so that even a ripple is sufficient to drown him. He was talking about the Chinese peasantry, actually, in that context. And the title of my book was The Subsistence Ethic and Peasant Politics, or something like that. And then I was convinced by having read The Moral Economy of the English Crowd in the 18th century, that to use The Moral Economy in the title. I think it was a mistake, actually, in the long run, because it suggested to people who didn't read the book carefully that I had a series of altruistic peasants who weren't operating rationally, and it was one for all and all for one, which is not even remotely the argument of the book. And by Popkin calling his book The Rational Peasant, it also suggested that my peasants were crazy, or at least dewy-eyed.
You mentioned, we mentioned Thompson there, and we were talking about the three portraits of people who you admire that you would have on your desk. Who were the others? And we know about Thompson. Who were the others?
Well, the other, Mark Bloch, I was very taken by the Annales school of a larger scale history that was not a history of events. And by Bloch's effort, I think the essential characters of French oral history and the two little volumes on feudalism are amazing, truly amazing books. And Bloch's capacity to stand on a hillside and kind of read the agricultural history from the land form and the hedges and so on is something to which I aspire. The other person who, as I mentioned at lunch, would have been on the wall as well, and is on the wall, is A.V. Chayanov, who was following the German and Austrian traditions of household budgets and household work routines and household labor surveys. He did these so-called Zemstvo studies at the early 20th century in Russia that established social organization of the household and its labor and its use of children and the way in which it hedged bets. And he was the first person, I think, to absolutely establish a set of family cycle, a set of strategies, the consequences of having many dependent children who can't yet work and only so many able-bodied people in the way in which the structure of the farm changes over time. But I thought he had put an empirical basis of a solid kind under a series of speculations for the first time. And it was, I found it extremely useful in the moral economy of the peasant. That's interesting, the next step in which I was often asked after Moral Economy of the Peasant where I had done my field work, and the fact is Moral Economy of the Peasant was a library work, using archives and so on.
But it was mainly on Malaysia.
No, it was mainly on Burma and on Vietnam. Actually nothing on Malaysia at all. So these were two places where there were rebellions. I led up to the rebellions in the 1930s in Vietnam and in Burma. And so the object was to work up to these rebellions and explain them in these terms. And so I was always embarrassed when the book did well and I was asked where I'd done my field work to actually, I looked down at my shoes and admit that actually I hadn't done any field work, that this was archival work. And I had read by that time a lot of anthropology about peasants, including Eric Wolf's work. And I was convinced that it was fairly simple on my part. I thought, well, most of the world, in those days it was true, most of the world are peasants. And so if human welfare and development make any sense at all, it ought to benefit the life world of peasants. And so I conceived the idea that I would spend the rest of my life studying peasants. And I thought, if I'm going to do that, and I more or less consciously thought, well, this is a noble way to spend your life, then you are going to have to know, anytime you are tempted to some stupid fourth order generalization, the only way to prevent you from doing some really stupid things is to know one place like the back of your hand, so that you can test these fourth order generalizations against a real place, real people. And I've actually, it's important to say that I have never been able to understand fourth order generalizations without seeing them walk on the ground with real people and see how they operate in a concrete context. And so for me, the most important book for me, in terms of blood, sweat, and tears, and intellectually the most important for me, I think, was Weapons of the Weak. It was on the basis of 2 years in a village. And I had never worked so hard before, never worked so hard since. And because you work from the moment you open your eyes in the morning till you close them at night. And
You spent a continuous 2 years there.
no, it was like a year and 3 months, and then a break of 3 months or 4 months, and then back in the village for another 7 or 8 months. Total of 2 years with it.
This was in Malaysia.
In the middle, right.
Yeah.
And it may be worth adding that I had what I thought then was a very clever idea, which I hope someone will carry out fully. Which, my idea was this, that I would do my field work in the village. I would go off and write what I thought was a synopsis of my argument about what I thought was happening in the village. And then I would come back to the village and I would speak this to villagers. And I would then write down what they had to say. And the last chapter of my book would be an early review of my book by the villagers themselves, or the villagers speak back. And I actually did this. Except that in that last 4 months when I was explaining what I thought I knew to people, they corrected me in so many ways that I was faced with the possibility of writing a rather stupid book and giving them all the intelligent things to say in the last chapter, or smuggling their insights into the book itself. So I ended up abandoning them. I did, as a technical exercise, I did exactly what I said I wanted to do, but I then wrote the book not in that spirit. But if I had been braver, I might have. So it was. But I actually believe that it's a good way to conduct business. And one would hope, I know people actually who write ethnographies, that the people about whom the ethnographies are written would both like to read and would recognize themselves, even if they didn't quite agree with what was said about them. And it's the kind of anthropology to which I aspire, and there are a few people who actually do it, I think, with some style.
What do you think of that early pronouncement of Levi-Strauss that the people about whom you write wouldn't understand the models which you bring to, because it's at a level of which...
It's not that they would think of their action in that way, but they ought to recognize themselves, or if they don't, the writer ought to sort of try to understand why they don't recognize themselves.
Right.
I mean, it's not that, of course, this idea that social science takes place behind the backs of people is to a certain extent quite true. That's not how they would figure and explain their own behavior. But they ought to, you know, your colleague John Donne has written a fine little article on doing history of social science under realist assumptions that addresses exactly this this problem of what is the relationship of the subjects of social science to the descriptions of their action that social scientists reach. I think he does. I think that's. I practice what John Donne preaches.
You haven't actually described what the weapons of the week are.
That was so.
Do have some tea.
This was a. I had, of course, written about rebellions, and since I'm not a particularly brave person, I decided that I would like to do field work in it was the biggest rice growing area of Malaysia in the state of Kedah, and I found myself a village there, and of course. Malaysian politics was not even remotely revolutionary in that period, but it was rather like the Captain Swing rebellions in the 1830s in England. They were introducing combine harvesters, people were losing their jobs, there was a great deal of class conflict in the countryside, and so it was like being back in the 1830s in southwestern England, if you like. And since it was impossible to organized, there were no riots, it was a repressive state. There were a whole series of strategies of class contestation, to use Charles Tilley's terms, that took place below the radar. That is to say, a series of some forms of actual arson and sabotage, but also, and burning of people's crops and killing of their animals, but also strategies of slander, sort of boycotts of their feasts. And it occurred to me that for most of the people in the world not living in open political systems in which they are free to organize and protest and no formal organizations with office holders and banners and so on, that most of the class resistance in the world is this below the radar form of what I call everyday forms of resistance. And so my objective was with slavery and serfdom and this situation to try to understand a kind of politics that most people in modern organized democratic systems don't understand, and that is historically the most common form of politics for subordinate groups. So that's what got me into the, if you like, the subaltern studies crowd and making an intervention at that level.
Was it taken up by, for instance, people working on Eastern Europe just before the end of it?
Used in Eastern Europe. I mean, it was rather pleasing to see it being, of course, as I'm sure you can identify with, by people who hadn't actually much read the book. So the Weapons of the Week, which is a particularly good title, and I realize one of the dangers of a good title is that people can kind of wave it as a wand without actually having read the book very carefully and say, Weapons of the Week, end of the story. So it traveled as a slogan. pretty far and wide as these things, as social science goes, and I thought often traduced in the bargain. Although the thing that I'm proudest about in that book is a really careful effort to work out Gramsci's idea of hegemony as it would work in a peasant setting like that.
I mean, in the Wikipedia review of your work, it says that you and Gramsci have opposite opinions about hegemony.
Right.
Is that true?
Well, I think I put it that way more than I would now in Weapons of the Weak. That is to say, I was talking about, in Gramscian terms, I was talking about a situation of domination. And so, technically, in a sense, hegemony doesn't apply in situations of domination. How shall I put this? What I wanted to show is that for an anthropologist or an historian, that because of in situations of domination, you get a surface of political conformity and consent and performance in which everyone, the subalterns are tugging their forelocks and producing the formulas expected of them, and under such situations, what I call the public transcript is organized by the effects of power to produce the appearance of hegemony, and that we must never necessarily take this as convincing evidence of the establishment of hegemony unless we are able to recover what I call the hidden transcript, that is to say, what subordinate groups say among themselves when they're outside of the immediate effects of this power, so that unless you can overhear the slaves talking in the slave quarters, the serfs talking in the cells in their huts, right? And the poor peasants in my village talking about the rich peasants. So I found myself, I would be in situations where rich and poor villagers were together and everything would look like it was hegemonic. And then I would be among rich people, and there would be a different transcript, of course, because there were no poor to impress, no poor to elicit a performance from. Then I would spend time among the poor, and after a long period of time actually working with them and doing field labor, I would get their view of things. And so I thought that social science meant triangulating in terms of ideological effects between these three different transcripts in order to understand what people are saying. And for professors, this can be applied to almost any situation.
Academic life.
Hidden transcript of students talking about their professor outside the professor's earshot, etc.
Well, it's all on Facebook now, of course, so it's not hidden.
Excuse me?
It's all on Facebook now, so it's not hidden quite as much as they say what they think of you.
Right.
But you mentioned, before we come to the third book, which I'd like you to describe the state, you mentioned that your books are clearly simply written, which I've observed from my reading of them. Do you find writing easy, pleasant? Do you rewrite a lot? Do you write with pen? Can you tell us anything about the art of writing and how you write?
I was talking about this with Victoria Glendinning. She does everything on computer. When I'm doing original composition for a book or an article, I use, it's almost a fetish with me, I use a pencil and an eraser and block note Rhodia, is my favorite paper. And I probably write every sentence about 3 times before.
You write a sentence, then you rewrite it. Then.
Erase it, makes a big mess. And it's one of those things in which if you found a formula that you think works, you're terrified to vary it for fear that it's like rolling 7s and 11s in a dice game. You don't want to sort of change your shirt or anything. so I have continued this, and I think I write more slowly than almost anyone I know. It takes me a long time. It's about 8 or 9 years between books generally, and I'm working pretty hard in between. However, the advantage is that I worked so hard the first time to get that sentence out and to plan. It would take me months before I am happy with the outline and so on. So even before I start writing, I do a lot of work. It means that the revisions I have to do are probably less catastrophic than they are for many people. So my revisions tend to be fiddling here and there, or actually dropping out whole chapters or dropping in whole chapters. So I find I don't like to read my stuff again. I find my attention wanders, I get bored, I have to go out and feed the sheep or something. And so I'd rather work hard the first time to try to get it right, just so I don't have to go back over my own prose. Because I think that when you're cutting and pasting late in the game, it's hard to keep the continuity and narrative drive that you had the first time you were writing, that you lose something. So I think there are lots of ways to write successfully, and I don't even recommend my way. I think there are people who get things down fast early, and they probably end up writing things faster than I do. But everybody, there are lots of ways of writing well.
You mentioned going out to feed the sheep. Sheep have come up once, twice, and can you just tell me why an academic such as yourself is feeding sheep?
Well, of course, you remember I decided to work on peasants, and I started a program in agrarian studies. That was not until 1991, however. And when we moved from Madison to Connecticut, we decided, my wife and I, that we either wanted to move right to the middle of the city or all the way out in the countryside, because what we did not want to do is to live in a suburb. And one thing led to another, and we moved into the countryside. And so I had always wanted to keep animals. I'm not so much an agriculturalist. I'm not a gardener. I am a gardener, but not in a kind of distinguished way. But I got a few chickens and a sheep and a goat. And when I went to Malaysia to do Weapons of the Week, the farm across the street from us, the road from us, which we always admired, which had 46 acres, came up for sale, and we didn't have the money for it, and we felt bad about that. So we went off to Malaysia, and it turned out that the person who had bought it, the two brothers selling it had a dispute among themselves, and in any case, the farm hadn't sold and was on sale again at a much reduced price. And so we made a bid, and we bought this property, and it had a big barn, and I decided I wanted to raise sheep. I learned how to shear. I had maybe 25 sheep for about 20 years. I did all my own shearing. I sold the lambs to the Greeks and Italians at Easter. That's the big market for lambs in the United States. So after Greek Easter, the price of lambs goes down enormously. And I found, I put in good fences. And the fact is, raising sheep doesn't take a lot of work. It takes a half hour in the morning, a half hour at night. Maybe it takes a month during lambing season when you have to be around. It ties you down. And a few days shearing. But I would have, as I say, I would have pissed away that time, reading the New York Times or doing something else. And so I find it really wonderful to have an activity every day that requires your body and arms and your strength, but leaves your head alone, and you can just daydream, think up ideas. I find it actually creative. So I don't regard it, a lot of people ask me, how do you do the sheep and also, managed to be a scholar. And far from finding it a distraction and an annoyance, I actually think that it does exactly what I need every day by taking me away from just sitting around and pondering. I come back refreshed. Everyone does something like this, whether they play the piano or the cello or sing or whatever. So it's just and I like the idea of taking care of animals. There's something nice about the proudest thing So I changed my breed of sheep over time, finally to a sheep called Montedale, which is a cross between a Cheviot and Columbia. And I chose this breed because I wanted to minimize the number of lambs who I lost. The only sad thing about sheep raising is losing lambs. And for the last 3 years of sheep raising, I think I lost one lamb in 3 years. And I promise you, no sheep raiser in Connecticut had a record as good as I did. I mean, I didn't have, people care about the lamb crop and how many lambs they have. I cared only about minimizing the mortality of the lambs. So I kept ewes that had just single lambs rather than twins. Most people always want twins and so on. So I organized my life for the health and survival of my lambs, and I thought I'd done a good job. So even today, my standard version of a bad dream is to wake up after I've forgotten a lamb in the field or have fed one incorrectly, or I wake up in bad dreams having failed lambs more than having failed people.
There's just one more book,
Right.
The State book.
Seeing Like a State.
So, Seeing Like a State, isn't it?
Right.
So tell me how that came about and what its theme is.
Well, it's actually a different book, and you wouldn't be absolutely certain, having read that, with the rest of the things that I've written, that it was written by the same person, perhaps. I can make connections, but I'm not sure they're self-evident. As I said, I ran this program in agrarian studies for now it's 18 years. And so it started in 91. Seeing Like a State was published in 97. And you could say that the book grew out of the seminar I gave myself in this program in agrarian studies. So agrarian studies has an outside speaker or someone who brings a paper. They don't actually speak. Every week, first semester, second semester. So it's pretty intensive. And I also teach a course on the comparative study of agrarian societies with a couple of other 2, 3, sometimes other faculty. It's the biggest graduate course at Yale. And we had an endless succession of people who were talking about development in the third world, the history of Western agriculture, failed development projects, and so on. And over time, this idea of how, if there's an original idea in Seeing Like a State, it's this idea of legibility, the way in which Ian Hacking actually gets into this a little bit, in which the state, in order to be able to manipulate a society, has to know that society, and it knows it through the abstract statistics, cadastral surveys, the creation of a kind of legible society that can then be manipulated and be the object of policy changes. And so I tried to understand how forms of creating legibility also create rigidities and also create a failed development projects. So cases that there are a couple of chapters in general about legibility and how we ought to understand legibility. And then there's the case of Lenin versus Luxembourg on the role of the Van then there's a study of Brasilia as a one-off city in the wilderness, and Jane Jacobs as the sort of great critic of the high modernist city. And then there's Julius Nyerere and Tanzanian villages. There's a little one in Southeast Asia. And then there's a couple of chapters on industrial agriculture. There was a chapter on TVA, which I threw out, that appeared in another book later because the book was too long. And then there is something that's been picked up a lot on what I call, it's the Greek term translated as cunning with respect to Odysseus, natus. And but its better meaning is the kind of knowledge that can only come with experience of doing, but things that can't be learned from a book, whether it's fishing or shearing sheep or riding a bicycle. You can't give someone a book on how to ride a bicycle and just then push them off and have them ride a bicycle. They have to feel the, right? So I tried to work out all of the activities to which this kind of knowledge is more valuable than knowledge that can be codified and embodied in a set of regulations. And so, you can, this is actually where Hayek gets to be interesting, and Michael Oakeshott gets to be interesting. You can describe the rules that to make up grammar, but they don't teach you how to make a good sentence. You can describe the rules and regulations that cover an office, but it doesn't explain how the office actually works. And so the anarchist part of this, I don't know if you've worked a rule strike in which whenever the Parisian taxi drivers are pissed off at Parisian authorities, they have a work to rule strike in which they follow all the traffic rules, and traffic comes to a halt because it only moves because of a judicious evasion of these rules. And I think that's a very important anarchist insight. So that's the anarchist side of this.
We've only got time just really for one more subject. One I was going to ask you about was Burma and your current work. Is that the work that's coming out in the new book? Is that about Burma?
Well, it's about Burma, but it's about Zomia, as I mentioned. It's about this large area. The argument of the book in Unjustifiable Brevity is that all of these people who live in the highlands are seen by lowland people as a primitive remnant, as the Thais would say, our living ancestors, what we used to be like before we discovered Buddhism and civilization and wet rice cultivation and so on. My argument, I think on the basis of the evidence, is that almost all of these people in the hills were virtually empty until about 1500. But the hills are filled up gradually by people running away from state-making projects in the valleys. These are not people left behind. These are people who put themselves out of are state-evading people who running away from taxes, from forced labor, from wars, from epidemics, and so on, and who become ethnicized in the hills over time. And their agriculture, swiddening, root crops, and so on, is an effort to evade appropriation. Their distribution of villages and fishing, so everything about them that makes them look primitive, including, I speculate, even their illiteracy. I argue that many of these people had a literate minority at one time and left literacy behind on purpose because it suited them better to make up their genealogy and their itinerary. And so all the things that make these people look primitive, I argue, are by and large state-evading strategies. That's why, of course, Piers' Vitebsky's work on the reindeer people and work on the Inuit and work on other non-state peoples who tried to stay out of the way of states has become very interesting to me, including gypsies and so on.
Reminded me of gypsies.
Right.
There's 2 minutes. Is there anything you really would have liked to have said that I haven't asked you about? I mean, you mentioned your family and
Well, I'm trying to picture the person who would consult your archive and what they would like to know, or what would be useful to them. I think that I've remained relatively faithful to the desire to work on the peasantry and to work on rural masses, if you like. I would have seen it in my Marxist phase in that way. And what has surprised me, I guess, is the anarchist term that I've taken. Not that we can do without the state, it's the ground of our freedoms and our aggression, so it's not as if I'm a utopian in that respect. But I found myself again and again, the reason I taught a course on anarchism a couple of times in the last 10 years is that I found myself saying things in class often, and then saying to myself, that's what an anarchist would say, Scott. And it happened enough so that I thought, I had better take these things seriously, and so I read most all of the anarchist classics and taught a couple of courses on anarchism. And it was a great experience for me. It was also a great experience because once you announce that you're teaching a course on anarchism, you get the undergraduate left at Yale. I got all of them in my class. And so I had, I think, like 150, 200 students. And I think if you dropped a kind of bomb on my classroom, we would have destroyed the left wing of the university at one blow. And I also find those students today, especially with the kind of, at least until recently, a kind of neoconservative reconsolidation of power, I found those students to be the most interesting in many ways. And so I think they educated me as much as I've educated them.
That's excellent.
Professor James Scott, Sterling Professor of Political Science and Anthropology and Director of the Agrarian Studies Program at Yale, has been provoking, challenging, informing and inspiring us for so long and in so many ways, both within and beyond the arenas most central to our concerns as Southeast Asianists, that it's impossible to conceive of anyone else more welcome and more suitable to open our proceedings today. You will all know his remarkable work. He's enriched our vocabulary and stimulated our thinking with his writings on peasant insurgency, agrarian resistance, state legibility projects, and the high modernist taming of nature. His books, The Moral Economy of the Peasant, Weapons of the Weak, and Seeing Like a State, are classics in our field, still read, still fought over by our students, and an abiding spur and stimulus to the rest of us. His most recent work, and I gather there's another book soon to be published, The Art of Not Being Governed, adds very compelling concerns to the range of issues he's engaged with from his distinctive interdisciplinary perspective. His title for us tonight is provocative, and so with very keen anticipation, I invite him on your behalf to deliver our Mellon Lecture. Its title is Introducing Zomia, Site of the Last Great Enclosure Movement of Relatively Stateless Peoples in Mountainous Southeast Asia. Professor Scott.
Thank you for that generous introduction. I'm flattered to be asked to deliver the beginning lecture for this conference. You could say that Cambridge has always been on this map of Southeast Asia, but it's not clear to me that Southeast Asia has always been on the map of Cambridge. And so one hopes that this is not a one-off event, and that the young scholars who have organized this event will organize other events, and that Southeast Asian Studies will remain a permanent presence at Columbia. And I also look forward, having been inspired by the acronym for the sponsor of this conference, CRASH. I look forward to other children of CRASH. Pop, wow, bang. The possibilities are absolutely endless, and I'll be happy to collaborate in organizing events under such acronyms. I want to begin my talk with the closing phrases of Pierre Closter's great work, La Société Comportementale. He writes in the last 2 sentences of his book, "It is said that the history of peoples who have a history is the history of class struggle. It might be said with at least as much truthfulness that the history of peoples without history is the history of their struggle against the state." Pierre Closter was the first to suggest that what had seemed to anthropologists in South America as Neolithic survivals, the Siriono, the Yanomamo, the Guarani, were actually ex-sedentary cultivators who had taken up foraging to escape forced labor in the Spanish Reducciones and to escape disease, and that they had, in the course of taking up a foraging life, organized themselves socially so as to prevent powerful chiefs from arising among them. He echoed Owen Lattimore's insight, and those of many others actually, who regarded nomadic pastoralism not as an earlier subsistence form, but as a secondary adaptation, an adaptation to sedentary agriculture of cultivators who put themselves at a distance from taxes and from the state and took up a pastoralist life. I hope with my argument to please the ghost of Pierre Closter. Zomia in this title, not my invention, the invention of Willem van Schendel, a Dutch scholar, is a new name for virtually all the lands lying above roughly 200-250 meters, all the way from the central highlands of Vietnam to northeastern India and Bangladesh, and traversing 5 Southeast Asian nations, northern Vietnam, a little corner of Cambodia, Laos, Thailand, and Burma, 4 provinces of China, Yunnan, Guizhou, Guangxi, parts of Sichuan. It's an expanse of something like 2.5 million square kilometers, containing roughly 100 million minority peoples of truly bewildering ethnic and linguistic complexity. Geographically, it's also known as the Southeast Asian mainland Massif. Since this huge area is at the periphery of 9 states and at the center of none, since it also bestrides the normal regional designations, Southeast Asia, East Asia, South Asia, and since what makes it interesting is both its ecological variety and its relationship to states, it represents a novel object of study, a kind of, as an American, I think of it as a transnational appellation, a new way to think of area studies. My thesis is simple, suggestive, and controversial. Zomia is the last remaining region of the world whose peoples have not yet been fully incorporated into nation states. Its days are numbered. Not so very long ago, however, such self-governing peoples were the great majority of humankind. They are today seen from the valley kingdoms as our living ancestors, what we were like before we discovered wet rice cultivation, Buddhism, and civilization. On the contrary, I wish to argue that the hill peoples of the Massif are best understood as a runaway, fugitive, marooned community of peoples who have, over the course of 2 millennia, been fleeing the oppressions of state-making projects in the valleys: slavery, conscription, taxes, corvée labor, epidemics, and warfare. Virtually everything about these people's livelihood, social organization, ideologies, and more controversially, even their illiteracy, I would argue, can be seen as strategic choices designed to keep the state at arm's length. Their physical dispersion in rugged terrain, their mobility, their cropping practices, which I'll elaborate, their kinship structures, their pliable ethnic identities, their devotion to prophetic millennial leaders, are designed to avoid incorporation into states and to preventing states from springing up among them. The particular state that most of them have been evading, of course, is the precocious Han Chinese state. The history of flight is embedded in many hill legends. The documentary record, although it's rather speculative until 1500, is clear enough after that, including frequent military campaigns against hill peoples under the Ming and Qing dynasties, and culminating in the unprecedented uprisings in southwestern China in the mid-19th century that left millions seeking refuge. The flight from both the Burmese and Thai slave-raiding states is also amply documented. Approaching Zomia as an object of study and the populations of Zomia is novel in other ways. The huge literature on state-making, contemporary and historical, pays virtually no attention to its obverse, that is to say, the history of deliberate and reactive statelessness. This is the history of those who got away, and state-making can't be understood apart from it. It's also what makes this something of an anarchist history. This account also potentially brings together the history of all those peoples extruded by coercive state-making and unfree labor systems. Gypsies, Cossacks, Inuit, polyglot tribes made up of refugees from the Spanish Revoluciones in the New World, and in the Philippines, fugitive slave communities, the Marsh Arabs, perhaps the San Bushmen as well. The argument reverses much of the received wisdom about primitivism generally. Pastoralism, foraging, shifting cultivation, segmentary lineage systems are, I argue, and ought to be seen as, a secondary adaptation, a kind of self-barbarianization, if you will, adopted by peoples who have strategically chosen their location, their subsistence pattern, and their social structure with state evasion in mind. That is to say, it's a political choice. Let me just show you a map briefly of the area roughly incorporated in Zomia. It is the white area of the map, more or less, and I've extended all the way down the Annamite Cordillera in Vietnam and probably further down in the Thai-Burma border than I might otherwise have. If my argument is accepted, it is also something of a deconstruction of Chinese and other civilizational discourses about the barbarian, the raw, the primitive. On close inspection, these terms boil down to ungoverned and not yet incorporated peoples. In this sense, the possibility of people voluntarily going over to the barbarians, as it were, has never been entertained, and hence such statuses are stigmatized and ethnicized. Ethnicity and tribe begin exactly where taxes and sovereignty end. This was true of the Roman Empire by and large, and it was true of the Chinese Empire as well. Usually, forms of subsistence and kinship are taken as given, as ecologically and culturally determined. By analyzing various forms of cultivation, particular crops, certain social structures, and physical mobility patterns for their escape value, I treat these givens as largely political choices. My rather tendentious description of this as the last great enclosure of stateless peoples ought to be framed by a potted history of states and stateless people. If we take the broadest angle lens, Homo sapiens sapiens has been around for roughly 200,000 years. In Southeast Asia, Homo sapiens has been around perhaps for 60,000 years. No longer than 60,000 years, and perhaps as few as 50,000 years. Sedentary grain agriculture has been around in this area for perhaps 8,000 years. The small states of Southeast Asia arose roughly 3,000 years ago. Sedentary agriculture is a necessary condition, not sufficient, but a necessary condition for state formation in most settings. It's possible to find sedentary agriculture without states, but states without sedentary agriculture are extremely rare, and the exception that proves the rule are places like Malacca and so on that sat astride important trade routes or bottlenecks and were able to dominate. In general, the states that I'm talking about controlled a minuscule portion of the globe. These early states. Outside these states, the area that they could not control was considered fiscally sterile. That is to say, it was the site of dispersed peoples and dispersed production. There was no easy way to access its resources or to access its people. This huge area was seen then by the early states as a kind of barbarian periphery, by Chandragupta kingdoms, by the early Han dynasties, and by Rome. Relations with barbarian peoples were of two kinds. The first relationship, and perhaps the most important one, was the relationship of trade. That is to say, this barbarian periphery and the early states were always joined as complementary ecological zones, knitted together by a continuous and vital trade for both partners in the exchange. This was a voluntary integration, an economic integration through exchange, and was compatible with the political autonomy of the periphery, with the political autonomy of the stateless peoples. The second relationship between these early states and its periphery was that the periphery was a source of slaves. Slaves were the most important item in world trade in this early period in classical Southeast Asia, even before the heyday of the North Atlantic slave trade. Most Malay cargoes, the most important cargo in Malay ships in the Sunda Shelf were slaves. People were moved from this fiscally sterile zone and a landscape that was impossible to appropriate to a new setting under the control of these early states, where these people's labor and their product could be assessed and could be monopolized. This was the great demographic shift in early Southeast Asia. These grain-based states were militarily strong. Their grain-based property systems with inherited property made for high fertility and for the military wherewithal to accumulate more slaves. Almost all of these systems were expansionist, and one can see, in a sense, colonialism from this perspective. That is to say, the white settler colonies in the United States, Australia, Canada, Argentina, are in fact the transportation of the neo-European grain complex to the New World, a reproduction of sedentary grain landscapes and communities and states. In those colonial lands that were already fully occupied by sedentary cultivators, the job of colonialism was to take possession of these states, of its agricultural land, and to, in a sense, tax this land more efficiently with cadastral surveys and an administrative elite. That is to say, the indigenous state, which operated as an agrarian state, was replaced by a colonial state. Notice that even at this period, much of the globe is still ungoverned by states. There are large zones of no sovereignty. There are zones of mutually canceling weak sovereignty. Then in the 20th century, and it varies depending on which particular location we're talking about, there are two changes that transform everything. And I'll mention these two changes because after these two changes take place, none of what I have to say makes the slightest sense. That is to say, the 20th century idea of the strong nation-state exercising full sovereignty up to the physical borders of the state, after which, a quarter of an inch beyond that mythical border, it meets the full sovereignty of an adjacent state. There has been, in a sense, the effort that has been technologically enabled in the 20th century for states to exercise this sovereignty to the full extent of their legal property claims. The second change is that it's turned out that the value of this periphery for mature capitalism turns out to be far greater than it was for the earlier states. This periphery is valuable for minerals, for coal, for iron ore, oil, timber, copper, bauxite, the rare minerals for aerospace and electronics, for hydroelectric projects, and so on. Therefore, there have been impelling reasons for mature capitalist states to exercise control into this periphery for the products that are vital to modern economies. As I say, the story I'm telling only holds water up to the point in which these two last changes take place. Let me return to Hill-Valley relations, which are the focus of my interest. It's the biggest social cleavage in Southeast Asia, I think, historically. And in broad stroke terms, the valleys have been historically characterized as the site of states, of agrarian states, as sites of hierarchy, of permanent tax regimes, of kings and permanent clergies, of large-scale warfare, of civilization, as they describe it themselves, and, perhaps most important, of wet rice cultivation. The hills, by contrast, are the site of largely swing forms of rotating cultivation. No permanent states or extremely unstable states. Population dispersal, relative egalitarianism, a tremendous amount of cultural variety, and no regimes of permanent taxes for kings or clergy. The paradox, in a sense, is that people have been moving back and forth across this divide in huge numbers for as long as we know. Hill people have been becoming valley people. This is the familiar civilizational narrative. But until the mid-19th century, it was just as common for valley people to move to the hills. This is not less acknowledged, largely because the hills are seen as a barbarian periphery, as the site of our living ancestors. Hill tribes represent, let's say to the Thais or the Vietnamese, our living ancestors, what we were like before we discovered wet rice cultivation and civilization. So for Vietnamese and for Thais, a trip to the hills is also a trip historically back to what we were like. It's worth recalling, however, that as Owen Lattimore pointed out, and others have since as well, that the Great Walls of China were built quite as much to keep the Chinese in as to keep the barbarians out, to prevent taxpayers and sedentary cultivators from leaking away. And yet, a bright line has always existed between hills and valleys. This was noticed in terms which are worth quoting, but of which I disapprove, by Fernand Braudel in the second chapter of Mediterranean World when he talks about mountains. He writes, and I quote, "The mountains are as a rule a world apart from civilization, which are an urban and lowland achievement. Their history, that is to say the mountains' history, is to have none, to remain always on the fringes of the great waves of civilization, even the longest and most persistent, which may spread over great distances in the horizontal plane, but are powerless to move vertically when confronted with an obstacle of several hundred meters." Paul Wheatley, speaking about Southeast Asia, notes that the Sanskritic tongues were stilled to silence at 500 meters. Virtually the same observation. Ibn Khaldun noted that Arabs were able to conquer flat territory, but when they confronted mountains and gullies or extensive deserts, their power could no longer be extended. Paul Moose, speaking of Vietnam, wrote, and I think I have the quote more or less right, that the great Vietnamese or Kin ethnic adventure stopped at the buttresses of the Annamite Cordillera. is not that civilizations can't climb hills, but rather that people climb hills in order to get away from civilizations, or more precisely, to get away from states. That if we take a 2,000-year perspective, we can see people moving to the hills in response to state-making projects in the valley, fleeing taxes, conscription, fleeing because of political dissent of a religious or a political kind, fleeing famines and disease made possible in part by the crowding and monocropping of the valley urban conglomerations, desertion from armies, and something in the hills. The process then in the hills resembles a kind of ratchet effect, with people in pulses going to the hills depending on the conditions in the valley. Sometimes moving toward the valley, sometimes moving toward the hills, depending on the state of the economy, prosperity, and peace, and so on, in the valley. In times of disorder and war, people are moving, more people are moving toward the hills. And what you have ethnically then in the hills is what I describe in a fairground metaphor as a maniacal game of bumper cars, in which you have groups moving to the hills, pushing groups that were there before further, shattering them in one direction or the other. And the way in which we ought to understand the tremendous complexity, ethnically and linguistically, of the hills is to see them as a shatter zone of shards of different states and lowland conglomerations that have moved at different times and at different rates into the hills. There is a shatter zone in Africa that one can define that goes in exactly that area that is outside the range of slaving states, of slave raids. Those places that were safe from slave raids got a much larger population than they would otherwise have had because of their inaccessibility, their hills, and the difficulty of moving across this terrain. And there is then a smaller, not as large as Zomia, but there is a shatter zone there. The people who've studied the gypsies, for example, there's an area called the Outlaw Corridor, or the Gypsy Corridor in 17th and 18th century, early 18th century Europe, that was between recruitment into the galleys in the south and conscription by Prussia Brandenburg in the north. And it was exactly that zone where people ended up that was outside the range of effective serfdom and capture. These people, as I mentioned, historically in Zomia have been fleeing the Tang dynasty at its height of its power early on, the Yuan dynasty, the Ming, and the Qing. Chinese moved into the hills after the Great Taiping Rebellion, and in World War II, and even in the Great Leap Forward, you had populations, Hua and Aka, moving into Burma from southern China where they felt safer. In the hills, then, you have a process of ethnogenesis. The model, I suggest, that we might use for this process of transformation is the model that would describe the formation of the Cossacks. The Cossacks were nothing more and nothing less than refugees from European Russian serfdom, from all over European Russia. And if they accumulated in the Don Basin, they became the Don Cossacks, the Azov Basin. I think there was something like 14 or 15 Cossack hosts, depending on where they settled. They copied in many places the horseback habits of the Tartars. They were in a new ecological setting with open land and common property resources, and they became, at the frontier, a people. And you could argue that today, Cossack identity is perhaps the strongest ethnic identity in Russia, but it was essentially and originally a maroon community of refugees from serfdom in Europe that had no ethnic cohesion whatsoever. The other model, I think, is Ernest Gellner's description of marginal tribalism. And let me quote him. Marginal tribalism, he writes, is the type of tribal society, he's writing about Berbers, of course, which exists at the edge of non-tribal societies. It arises from the fact that the inconveniences of submission make it attractive to withdraw from political authority, and the balance of power and the nature of the mountainous or desert terrain make it feasible. Such tribalism is politically marginal. It knows what it rejects. Let me then return to valley ecology and demography, and then hill ecology and demography. A famous Thai proverb that almost everyone cites goes something like this: put vegetables in the basket, put people in the mong. Mong being the small political unit of settled agriculturists in Thailand. It's a reference to the concentration of manpower and agricultural production in a small space. Let's imagine for a moment that you were Southeast Asian Jean-Baptiste Colbert, and it was your job to design the ideal kingdom under pre-modern conditions. Pre-modern conditions of transportation. You would want to concentrate manpower and foodstuffs in a relatively small radius, something like 200 kilometers as a rule of thumb. I believe that you would invent something very like wet rice cultivation. It offers the maximum concentration of population and production in a small area. There are other advantages of paddy rice. They will sound silly and obvious, but they'll make a little more sense when I move to hill forms of cultivation. Paddy rice, of course, is a grain that grows above the ground. In many cases, a paddy field's grain ripens at roughly the same time. If the tax collector or army want your paddy rice, all they have to do is show up when it's ripe, and they can have it all. Or if they don't like you, they can burn you out. Paddy rice stores well, unhusked, and has relatively high value per unit weight and volume, and can be transported over relatively large distances compared to other food products. Thus, rice cores, where they existed, often produce states. Large rice cores would occasionally produce large states. Small rice cores would occasionally produce small states. Again, necessary but not sufficient condition. The problem in Southeast Asia was holding population in this area, hence slavery. Population in 1700 in Southeast Asia is roughly 5 people per square kilometer. This compares to India and China of a population between 33 and 37 people per square kilometer. The demography is radically different. And one can read this demography in the proverbs about statecraft in Thailand and in Burma. A Burmese proverb says, "Ah, yes, it is easy for a serf to find a lord, but for a lord to find a serf, and that is difficult." A Thai proverb goes, in a large house with many servants, the doors may safely be left open. In a small house with few servants, the doors must be kept shut. And so the Thais developed a system of tattooing in which the serfs were branded with a mark that would designate their owner, and that bounty hunters, of course, the forest, could then return them to their rightful owner in return for the bounty. Hence, wars in Southeast Asia were almost never wars for territory per se, but wars for slaves, for slaving expeditions. It's worth at this juncture to say something about the geography of state power. And here we return to Brodel in a much more favorable light, and to Anthony Reid, and the principle that water joins and difficult terrain divides. It is said that in 1800, the trip from Southampton to the Cape of Good Hope took about as long as going by stagecoach from London to Edinburgh overland. Even if that is close to being true, it's a remarkable statistic. The other historical fact that impressed me about water joining and land separating is that in 1951, the first Chinese units of the People's Liberation Army in Lhasa were running out of food and had to be resupplied with 3,000 tons of rice. How was the rice shipped to Lhasa? It was shipped by boat to Calcutta, through the railroad, north through Bangladesh, and then 16 days on mule and horseback into Lhasa, because that was the fastest way of getting rice to the troops in Lhasa. Our standard maps of Southeast Asia in this respect are profoundly misleading. 300 miles over easy water is in every meaningful respect much closer than 20 miles over rugged mountain paths. What we need to have for Southeast Asia are what I would call friction of distance maps, or friction of terrain maps, in which the unit of measurement is not a mile or a kilometer, but a day's walk, a day's ox cart ride, or a day's travel by a small boat. I have a modest example. It's hard to represent, actually. I've tried to make maps that are more fiendishly clever than the one I have here. But this is a small Thai statelet on the Burma-Thai border. And what I've done is, by a series of formulas, it is possible to imagine what the distance that a person could walk if the terrain were flat. And the dotted lines represent that's 1 day's walk, this is 2 days' walk, this is 3 days' walk across a perfectly flat terrain. And then, correcting for the actual terrain, you get 3 nested borders. This would be 1 day's walk, this would be 2 days' walk, and this would be 3 days' walk. It gives you some sense for the radical difference that it makes, uneven terrain makes, and the possibilities for integrating a state and its population. Such a map would vastly shrink the terrain of rugged mountains, stretch. Such a map would vastly stretch the terrain of rugged mountains, swamps, and marshes, and vastly shrink the terrain of flat plains across easy water, calm and navigable seas. It would look to us like a crazy map, a kind of fairground mirror map, but it would not be distorting. It would rather be far more accurate if we were actually interested in contact and exchange, in trade and cultural influence, in linguistic and religious integration, but not necessarily political integration. And of course, kingdoms historically have been united across water. The Malay kingdom is a classic example, and the Greek world of the Aegean is another example. The great states of mainland Southeast Asia were always located on navigable riverways: the Irrawaddy, the Chinlin, the Sitang, the Chao Phraya, the Tonle Sap, which is an arm of the Mekong, and the Red River area of Vietnam. The exception that proves the rule is the Salween, or New River, or Than Uyên River, and the reason it's the exception is because it moves through a narrow gorge through almost all of its length, and it's only at its estuary that you have the small kingdoms of Martaban and Tapon, and today the city of Moyamai. But it's the exception that proves the rule, because it does not produce, if you like, the alluvial plains in which a lot of rice can be grown. States stopped then, not just at mountains, but they stopped at marshes and swamps. The way of my failure to devise a map that I could show you here requires me to have you imagine a map that I would like to make but have been unable to. So let's imagine for a moment that I am holding on a stiff board, horizontally, a map of Southeast Asia, of mountainous Southeast Asia and valley Southeast Asia, in which the terrain is actually represented by a physical relief. And imagine that every kingdom, traditionally, is represented on this map by a pot of red ink filled to the brim. And let's imagine then that I'm holding this map horizontal, and then I tilt it ever so slightly to the right and to the left and forward and back. And the ink will run out of this brimful cup located at each state site. And it will run into exactly those places where these states were able to project their power. It would give you a pretty good indication of, under most circumstances, of the scope of state power. And the more I tilted this map, the more this red ink would run into areas that were less flat, less accessible, and in a rough and ready manner of speaking, the degrees that I would have to tilt this map to get the red ink to run into a particular area would give you some rough indication of the degree of state exertion that it would take for a state to project its power into those areas. This corresponds with what Edmund Leach said when he said that everything above 500 meters in Burma was not Burma, that only the lowland rice plains constituted the terrain of the classical kingdoms of Burma. I would add to Edmund Leach's observation that in fact the classical kingdoms of Burma were also radically seasonal kingdoms. That is to say, under the height of the monsoon rains, these kingdoms shrank to essentially not very far beyond the palace walls. Even fairly recently, the Burmese campaigns against the Karen and Shan and so on have had to wait till the dry season. It's only with the most modern military technology and helicopters that wet season offensives have been possible. So the state was oscillating not only from year to year and decade to decade, was also oscillating with the annual monsoons as well. But before I say more about Zomia, let me tendentiously characterize the agriculture of the uplands. And let's imagine, again, that you are Jean-Baptiste Colbert, but now you've been hired by hill tribes. And your job is to devise a kind of agriculture that is proof against state appropriation and state control. I believe you would fall in love with the root crops. Taro, yam, sweet potatoes, cassava. Cassava is actually a New World crop, I might add. Cassava is my nominee for champion escape crop of the world. Cassava can be planted almost at any time, anywhere. It grows with very little care. It ripens in less than a year, but, and this is the crucial thing, it can be kept in the ground for another 2 years. And it's perfectly good to eat. If the state wants your cassava, it's going to have to dig it up tuber by tuber. And then it has a cart full of cassava tubers, which aren't worth a whole lot and can't be transported very far. This insight was not lost on Friedrich the Great, who at the siege of Philipsburg noticed that the peasantry managed to survive very well the siege for a long time, and he noticed that they were a potato planting people. And on this basis, he urged, not to say ordered, the Prussian peasantry to plant potatoes because he realized that armies could go back and forth. If you were growing grain, your grain could be burned. If you had it in granaries, the grain could be seized and taken away. If you were planting potatoes, the army might dig up a few potatoes for its evening meal. You could come back afterwards. You could dig up enough for your evening meal, and it allowed Friedrich the Great to have a peasantry that remained in place while armies went back and forth. And it's one of the reasons, at least, William McNeill believes that the Prussian peasantry, demographically relatively weak compared to many of their enemies, was able to do so very well against far more powerful and numerous enemies. Maize in Southeast Asia, another New World crop, was an escape crop as well. The Portuguese introduced it in the 16th century, and it spread within about 80 years to much of highland Southeast Asia. The crucial advantage of maize initially is that maize grows another 1,000 feet in the watershed above where unirrigated dry field rice will grow. And those people who adopted it It gave them another 1,000 feet of the watershed to retreat up and stay away from states that might seize their grain. Later on, of course, Han cultivators and people from the valley used maize to move into the hills themselves. You could say that swiddening by itself is a form of escape agriculture. You can grow wet rice almost everywhere in the hills where there are perennial streams. But swiddening has some crucial advantages. First of all, swidens are changed from time to time. They are characterized by polycropping. The typical swidden has maybe 20 or 30 things growing in it at any one time. They all mature at different times of the year. If the state arrives and wants to seize crops, there's probably only one or two things that are seizable at that time. Its population is fugitive because it also moves with the moving of cultivation. And it is a form of agriculture in which the sunk capital, let's take bunds and irrigation works, are absolutely minimal, and it allows people to move out of the way if they feel threatened by the state. In this sense, swidden agriculture, especially in those places where we have evidence, actually, of people moving and adopting swidden cultivation as a way of evading the state, because they know that their dispersion and their cropping practices make their production unavailable to the states and make it difficult for the states to seize them as well. I would argue also that, and I won't go into this in any detail, that peoples in the hills have also developed a state-repelling social structure. That is to say, the capacity to split on short notice into small groups and segmentary lineages, and to disperse across the landscape. A social structure capable of almost infinite disaggregation, patterns of fissioning, developing daughter villages, pioneering villages, observing the same thing, Ernest Gellner invented a proverb that he thought the Berbers ought to have, but didn't have, which is, divide that ye be not ruled. And it was clear to him that the Berbers understood that splitting into minimal segmentary lineages and dispersing across the landscape was a way to avoid state incorporation and control. A last argument that I will it's a speculative argument for which I have absolutely no evidence, but I think it's good to think about. So I've described a whole series of ways of living, techniques, structures that look like barbarism to people in the valleys, and that are arguably, historically, political choices to avoid state incorporation. Almost all the peoples in the hills have stories about how they once had literacy in books and don't have it anymore. And in the cases of many peoples, the Hmong, Miao, Mien, and so on, the argument is also that we planted wet rice, we had kings, we had books, we had literacy, and we lost it. And these stories are, they're ubiquitous. It's quite extraordinary how often one runs across them. And these stories are of two kinds. One kind is, we lost our literacy because of our own, we were profligate, we careless. We wrote it on a hide and the cow ate it, or we wrote it on something that was perishable, and while we were doing our swiddens, it burned up, our fault. And the second story is a story of treachery and betrayal. The older brother ran away with the books. The Chinese showed us the back of the slate rather than the front of the slate, so we didn't get the characters that were on the front of the slate. There are hundreds and hundreds of stories of this kind about the loss of literacy. I think that it's at least worth entertaining the possibility that literacy was more or less deliberately left behind by people who saw the advantages of an oral culture, of being able to reinvent their genealogy, reinvent their itinerary as it suited them. We know that, as near as we can tell, the Hmong, Miao, the Yao, Mien, were in the lower Yangtze Valley planting wet rice, cheek by jowl with literate societies, almost certainly had a small literate minority. After all, the period we're talking about 1,500 years ago, the literate minority of any civilization was a sort of tiny class. But it's completely plausible that they had a small literate minority. Then, what obviously happened, according to almost all accounts, is that as the Han expanded, many people remained and became, over time, Han. Some people moved away, remained Hmong Miao. Right? Han Kingdom expanded again. They moved further away. Some people were incorporated and stayed and assimilated, and some people moved away. And as these people became, if you like, a people on the move, finding themselves in novel political situations, having to make their peace with different kingdoms and tributary relations with different states, it strikes me that it may very easily have been in their interest to leave behind text. Once you have a written text that is your history, it can become a kind of trap. You can measure deviations from a kind of text in subsequent texts, if it's an earlier text. On the other hand, if you have an oral tradition, it can remain traditional while elements are dropped, elements are added, and it, if you like, adjusts itself in keeping with the political conditions and the stories that make most sense in a group's new setting. As I said, I'm not sure that in principle evidence is even adducible for such a suggestion, but it seems to me we do, of course, have lots of historical cases in which literacy is lost. It's lost in almost all of Roman Gaul, except for a few monasteries. It's lost in England entirely for a while. It was lost in Greece when the kingdoms were destroyed in the so-called Dark Ages of Greece, from which we have the great epics in which the Greeks were literate in Linear B. And then there's a period of 400 years when there is no evidence that any texts were produced, and then a new form of literacy came using the alphabet from Crete, a different kind of literacy. So it seems to me to be, although, again, completely speculative and with no evidence, it's another piece that one might put together with this pattern of historical moves to the hills and a form of social structure and agriculture that have an important escape value. So let me conclude by saying if these are people, as Brodel says, without history, it may well be that they are without a history because they choose to be without a history. Or one could say they have just as much history as they wish, and no more. Finally, it's worth noting that all of their characteristics, those that mark them out as barbarians to people in the valleys, physical dispersion, simplified social organization, no permanent rulers, shifting cultivation, living in remote, inaccessible places, not following the great lowland religious traditions, and perhaps literacy, are best understood not as a pre-existing primitivism, but as 1,500 to 2,000 years of strategic adaptations of political positioning vis-a-vis valley states, and not some primordial condition.
As anthropologists and scholars in other fields concerned with the recent past and with the contemporary experience of Southeast Asia, I think his lecture also offers us very, very rich food for thought. And I wonder whether some of the questions, like mine, will try to explore some of the implications of this fascinating perspective for the here and now, the relatively recent past, contemporary experience, and understanding the legacy of a notion of Zomia, or an experience of Zomia-like relations with states and other forms of political power, for what Ewa Ong has called today's post-developmental states, with their differentiating or graduated sovereignties and selective citizenship modes. Do we have something like oscillating states and state power interpenetrating with other kinds of political presence in the world of the people that Professor Scott is calling Zomians? I think it's very exciting and provocative to consider as freedom-seeking state evaders, or Zomians, the people known to regional specialists through terminologies deployed in specific national settings to proclaim their radical otherness from the self-defining mainstream of the supposedly civilized agrarian heartlands. Now, Professor Scott mentioned Malacca as a kind of exception proving the rule, and I did have a question about whether this fascinating enclosure and evasion model, a land-based picture of what he calls, in another version of this that I've read, hill and valley coevolution, places the importance of maritime life and commerce to the making and countering of the region's imperial and post-colonial power projects. What do we do about the sea, basically? Certainly, Zomia as a concept invites very productive rethinking of what we know about the practices and effects of that state-centric othering vocabulary as used in various national political languages that we're all familiar with. Orang Asli in Malaysia, so-called national minority peoples in China, Buffalo sacrificing Zantok or Montagnard people in Vietnam, and their Thai, Indonesian, and other equivalents. And I was thinking about this. It seems to me that the use of such terminology reflects the long-standing pre-modern and colonial subordination strategies, signaling triumphalist, though insecure and unsustainable value judgments about the differences between an imagined national society and ethnicized inner others. So I think Professor Scott is offering us new scope to probe that area of mutual stigmatizings and misrecognitions surrounding the power-laden self-other identity effects arising in sites of what he's calling relative statelessness. I'm thinking here of imaginings of so-called national minorities as a kind of mimetic inverse image of supposedly advanced and productive low themselves. And of course, such people, as we know, are often doubly stigmatized, as in the big state, late or post-socialist post-colonies like Vietnam, where I work, and also India, with the South Asian forms of what Professor Scott reads as state-directed legibility and enclosure projects have defined and essentialized such peoples as so-called casteless tribals or adivasis. I think it's notable and perhaps worth a bit of prodding that this double stigmatizing effect has been superficially romanticizing in ways that Middle East and Latin America specialists have explored with reference to official narratives about Bedouin Arabs and Amazonian peoples as noble, innocent, or pure, a kind of role model for the whole nation state, and at the same time condemning the non-commodifier who herds or hunts or burns for being deficient in the skills of the modern market economy and often suspect in their allegiances and political affiliations. And of course, already what I'm trying to do is ask about where is Zomia now? Is there still a kind of Zomia? Like these other inner others, the people Professor Scott calls Zomians are thus widely portrayed as outsiders to the national story, detached from or on the wrong side of their motherland's liberation and resistance struggles. Nowadays, they're often all the more suspect for being so widely attracted to the wrong kind of high-profile transnationalities in the form of things like US-backed evangelizing Christianity or NGO-sponsored human rights networks. Well, we're sure to have many questions from this audience, so I'll practice the precepts of righteous self-restraint and say just a little bit more to try to get some discussion started. We have this rich and provocative notion of Zomia, a refuge, a shatter zone, actively made and ordered, even illiteracy and active strategy and evasions of rulers, governance and enclosure projects. Clearly what I'm trying to do is ask about the here and now, and to say, well, we're being told to challenge narrow nation-state perspectives. We're not to think of Burmas or Laosis, tribes and uplanders, and think instead of a non-valley-centered world of many small units, contingent alliances, shifting archipelagic orderings. But what do we do if we sort of prod the word stateless? I think it's fascinating to draw on the classic oscillation models of Gellner and Leach, to portray as polities the entities with which Highlanders are locked or were locked, if you want to be more insistent that the historical story is different from the here and now. But whatever it is, there are oppositional relations with things that we should understand as polities. I wonder whether we confine it to the past or try to make it work for the present or the recent past. Is it a model that's very good at appreciating the story of dissident peoples' symbiotic relations with the claims and coercions of modern or maybe only pre-modern big states, but less well attuned to its and its invaders' engagements both with each other and with other important kinds of past and contemporary political entities? Obviously, the big centralizing states, whether past or present, have plenty of terrible power to create horrible versions of Agamben states of exception in ghastly limbo places like today's relocation sites and refugee camps, or some kind of earlier pre-modern form of the same sorts of thing. But does the concept of Zomia illuminate state evasion and state prevention, but maybe work a little bit less well for what people in places like Mizoram and Nagaland, or the Shan and Kachin, people in Vietnam, that the state fears now anyway, keep wanting a breakaway state-like sovereignty sponsored by Cambodia or US missionaries or somebody. In other words, people who construct real or at least shadow governments with their own armies, courts, laws and legibility regimens, people who want something like the state. Even more important, perhaps, is when people forge replicas of other kinds of political entities. Now, this part of my questions, I think, work a lot better for now, or maybe the odd-looking state forms of the 21st century, not the 20th century. I'm thinking of globalizing or transnational forms that they and their nation-states now interact with all the time. Transnational churches, NGOs, international peacekeeping forces, globalized international business enterprises. So the question then, how state-centered should our Zomia story actually be, whether it's about the past or the present? Where do we put semi-state-like and also transnationally non-state norms and forms of power in this very fascinating and very challenging approach to the region's anthropology and history?
Well, that was righteously brief, but I feel that my plate is nonetheless as full as it might possibly be. You pushed me where I expected to be pushed, actually, into more contemporary, the contemporary relevance of this. But let me say something about the historic relation of state power, just very briefly. I think it's important to distinguish historically in the classical states of Southeast Asia between what I would call hard power, that is to say, capacity to control people and brain at the core of the kingdom, which is actually the center of the military power and sway of the classical kingdoms. And that is confined to a relatively small area by the constraints of population leaking away, by slavery expeditions to bring people into the center, and by transportation technologies. This is all radically changed, of course, by railroads, all-weather roads, steamships, modern forms of distance-demolishing technologies of the modern world that made it just possible not only for the colonial power, but the post-colonial states, to project their power to the periphery. Historically, however, this hard power for the classical states was rather narrow. Their economic sway, that is to say, the zone of exchange, depending on the value and bulk of commodities, was that catchment area was much larger. But as I mentioned, it was compatible with the political autonomy, not the economic autonomy, but the political autonomy of these peripheral formations of people. Then, what I didn't mention actually was symbolic power. In the hills, that is to say, among the Shan, you will find their word for palace or hall, which is a copy of the Mandalay Palace in miniature. And then you go to the Kachin, and the Dua will have a small version of the hall that is a copy of a copy, right, in miniature. So all the ideas of political power beyond the village level that circulate in the hills are these fragments of power and symbolism, and you'll see you'll see Mandarin gentry jackets and staffs and documents of one kind or another that are symbols of authority, because the only circulating symbols of extra village authority in the hills are things that come up from the valley. And they travel so far and so effectively, and as Leach pointed out, there's an area where Indian and Semitic symbols overlap of this kind. And they travel so easily because, if you like, they're weightless as symbolic formations, and they can be found all over. So, if you like, state envy and state mimicry are absolutely ubiquitous in the hills, but very few hill formations have the capacity to make that pretense to stateness stick for any appreciable period of time. I also should add, it was a very important point. To contrast what we might call the maritime states of Southeast Asia from the agrarian states of Southeast Asia. These are not easy things to distinguish, and kingdoms like Ayutthaya is a complicated mixture of the two. But one can say that Srivijaya, Malacca were maritime kingdoms, coordinated across easy water, whereas Pagan was largely an agrarian kingdom, and the Han kingdom was largely an agrarian kingdom, except for the brief kind of period of exploration and so on. And just as one can imagine the difference between Russia, Germany, Prussia on the one hand, and Venice, Amsterdam on the other, and the radically different forms, the control over manpower is typical of the agrarian states, and as Charles Tilly and others point out, the agrarian states tend to win military confrontations, partly because of their access to manpower. So I think there's a different dynamic, and you have agrarian states in Southeast Asia like Bagul, the Man Kingdom in the south, and it's useful to compare this balance, and my account of wet rice and manpower works rather well, I think, for agrarian states, but doesn't work at all well for maritime states. Although maritime states need slaves as well. So Malacca and Srivijaya all the time. And my description, I'm taking back some of my generalizations, or at least modifying them. I think it's fair to say if you compare the Shan are an interesting exception, because the Shan are a state-making wet rice people, even though they have small states all the way from northern Vietnam over to India. Aside from the Shan, who are a kind of middle term, my distinction between stateless and stateful people ought to be modified by comparing what one would call shadow empires or parasitic little states. That is to say, at the periphery of all of the classical states of Southeast Asia, there were parasitic states who specialized in manning the frontier for the state, in providing slaves for the state. They were, if you like, a secondary state formation. But they were completely parasitic in the sense that they were shadow states in the sense that once the host disappeared, they disappeared with it. It was completely dependent on the services they could provide for the state. Then there are other peoples, like the Akha, most of the Lizu and Lahu and so on, the Karen are a more complicated case, could be described as a fleeing, fragmented people who are not characterized by state formation of any particular kind, and who are likely to go to the most remote areas, build hilltop villages that are well defended to prevent slave raids, and so on. And so one can, in a sense, make some important distinction between non-state people in terms of the degree of their tributary relationship to states, the services they provide. last thing I should say, lest we monopolize everything, is that today, of course, the population movement that's most characteristic is moving lowland people to the hills, and moving the major ethnic groups, groups in the major population groups to the periphery. So the huge movement of Vietnamese to the hills, replacing minority peoples with people who are presumably more loyal, who then occupy, who can be depended on, and who change the agricultural landscape into things that can be taxed. So transmigration in Indonesia is another example of the same kind. Thais are moving in large numbers to the hills. Sometimes it's a sponsored migration. Of course, Han are moving in huge numbers into Yunnan and Guizhou and so on. So in the last 50, 60, 80 years, it seems to me the huge demographic movement is of valley people who are engulfing hill peoples. And that's a completely different phenomenon, and it is, in a sense, the final conquest. When I said Zonia's days are numbered, it's, in a sense, the final demographic